by my colleagues in order of their arrival. Council President Andrea Campbell, Councilor Kim Janey, who are both the sponsors of today's hearing order, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Wu, and Councilor Zakem. I'm sure that we'll be joined by more as the morning goes on. I'd like to remind everyone that this is a public hearing being recorded and will be rebroadcast on Comcast 8, ASEAN 82, Verizon 1964, and online. I ask that you please silence your cell phones and other devices. If you wish to publicly testify, please check the box on the sign-in sheet when you sign in. When it is time for public testimony, I will ask that you please state your name and affiliation or residence, and that you limit your comments to a few minutes to ensure that all comments and concerns are heard. This is a hearing for docket number 0182, in order for a hearing regarding admission to Boston's exam schools. We are here to talk about what the Boston Public Schools can do to ensure that students from all backgrounds have the opportunity to earn a seat at one of the city's 3 exam schools: Boston Latin School, Boston Latin Academy, and the John D. O'Brien School. As a product of the Boston Public Schools, the O'Brien School before it was the O'Brien, when it was Boston Technical High School, as a former teacher at East Boston High School and a mother of 4 boys in BPS, I was taken aback by the report that was released this last fall by the Rappaport Institute. This report detailed many of the gaps of inequity in the exam schools. The report highlighted key areas where some of our students are getting left behind due to structural inequities. I also think this conversation needs to be focused not just on the exam schools, but on all of our city's high schools. This lack of attention to all of our city's high schools, I think, is the core to what we're dealing with today. I also would like to thank Councilor Campbell and Councilor Janey for filing this important hearing order and their commitment to equity. I look forward to hearing from all 3 panels today as we find solutions to address systemic detriments that prevent students of color from earning a seat at the exam schools. Our first panel will be representative of the Boston Public Schools, including our interim superintendent. Our second panel will be authors of the Rappaport Institute report. During the final panel, we will hear from social justice advocates from various organizations through the Greater Boston region. I do want to read, before we have opening statements from my colleagues, I'd like to read a letter from District Councilor Matt O'Malley. Dear Chair Asaibi George, I regret that I am unable to attend today's hearing on docket 0182 related to exam school admissions, as I am out of town. This topic is personally meaningful to me because I owe so much of my personal and professional success to my time at Boston Latin School. One of my top education priorities is to make sure every child and neighborhood has the same access to our exam schools that I had. Equally important is the work for educational excellence in our non-exam high schools and our elementary schools that prepare students for later success. I will continue to work with all of you to protect the integrity of our exam schools while making them a more perfect meritocracy that better reflects the vibrancy and diversity of our city. I am heartened by recent steps to expand access to the ISEE exam, and I believe that no student who would otherwise merit a spot at our exam schools would miss out because of administrative barriers. In particular, I advocate for an opt-out system where every qualified BPS student applies to the exam schools by default. The decision to take the test for the exam schools must not be left to an opt-in by a parent or teacher when some students are pushed by their schools and their families to take the test, and other equally bright students struggle on their own. This is one step to achieve the ideal that our exam schools represent. I look forward to reviewing the testimony and continuing engagement on this issue with all of you. Kindly read this letter into the record. Sincerely, Matt O'Malley. So I'd like to open up to comment from my colleagues. We'll start with Council President Campbell. We will start with Councilor Janey.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to Council President Campbell for your partnership. I certainly appreciate you joining me on this important hearing order. All BPS students deserve an excellent, rigorous education. In Boston, we are privileged to have some of the oldest, best public schools in the country. The principle of providing public education is embedded in our state's constitution and is fundamental in our city's economy and culture. For centuries, our schools have been a point of pride for our city, and our exam schools have been a major part of that pride. The current admissions policy of our city's exam schools is a simple formula: the student's grades from the previous year and a half, and the student's score on the ISEE exam. Both of these mechanisms actively disadvantage students from BPS elementary schools. This has resulted in a demographic makeup of the exam schools that is wildly different than the BPS student population. Last year, 41% of white students in BPS were offered admissions to an exam school, compared with 8% black students and 9.8% of Latino students. A coalition of civil rights organizations, which I've had the great honor and privilege to work with for many years, including the Lawyers for Civil Rights, Mass Advocates for Children, the NAACP, the ACLU, the Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts, and so many others, have been working to address this gap and have proposed several promising solutions, including reserving seats for the top students from each BPS elementary school or zip code, and using a more holistic approach to admissions. The problem with the ISEE exam have been discussed extensively, and Madam Chair, you just referenced the Rappaport report from Harvard. The exam includes concepts not covered in the BPS curriculum by sixth grade. There are also significant gaps in access to the test. Over 60% of white students took the ISEE, compared with 26% Black and Hispanic students. The ISEE has also failed to provide evidence that the test is free from bias, despite being included as a bid criterion by BPS. The use of grades also disadvantages BPS students. A report by WGBH found that in 2016, 10% of students entering Boston Latin School came from one elementary school, the Holy Name Parish School in West Roxbury. 43 students out of the class of 51 enrolled in Latin school, and 69% of the students had an A+ average. We should not be establishing a system that de-incentivizes parents from sending their students to our elementary schools. BPS has invested some resources in attempting to correct these inequities, providing free exam prep classes and attempting to increase access to the exam schools. Yet these efforts have failed to yield significant changes. It is high time that we begin the process of reforming the admissions policy of our exam schools. And I'll just share a brief story. And that is of my father, who graduated from Boston Latin School in 1964. In 1964, Latin school was all boys, and it was, it predates, his graduation date predates DSEG in the city of Boston. So DSEG came, the court order came in 1974. My father graduated in 1964, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. At the time when my father graduated Boston Latin School, which was largely a white institution, he was one of 8 black boys to graduate. And there were several other black boys in his class when he first entered Boston Latin School, having gone to the Dearborn School in Roxbury. I think there was probably 20 or maybe 30-ish students at that time who entered into the 7th grade, but only 8 graduated. And I tell that story because of what he experienced personally at that time in 1964, which was a hostile environment that encouraged the black students at that time to go across the street and enter into English high school, which at that time was across the street. And he was told that he didn't belong there from teachers and staff because he was from the projects. He grew up in Orchard Park projects and was told that he did not belong. Despite that, he persevered and pushed through and was one of 8 black boys to graduate. In 2016, we heard stories of incidents happening at Latin school where students of color, particularly black students, were not feeling supported in their environment. And that kind of kicked off, that launched Black at BLS. And I want to pay homage and give a shout out to Meggie and Kylie for their work. And they are now both, I think, in their third year of college, which is amazing. And, you know, this is important. This issue of access is very important if we are to eliminate the opportunity gaps in the city of Boston. The kind of education that one gets from our exam schools, particularly Boston Latin, cannot be matched. It is certainly one of the best schools, and you'll hear more of this from my colleague, Counselor Campbell, who graduated from Latin school and went on to an Ivy League education at Princeton University. And so when we think about who gets access and who does not, it has grave consequences for the future of our young people. And so this is a conversation that is certainly worth having. Are we doing all we can to ensure that our exam schools are receiving children from all over our city, particularly those who are coming up through Boston Public Schools? So I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm excited to continue the work that I was doing as an advocate with many of the organizations that I mentioned, and look forward to having a robust discussion. I want to thank the panel for being here, and all of the civil rights organizations and all of my colleagues, and certainly the headmasters from our prestigious exam schools who have joined us this morning, but also were part of this conversation. We thought it very important to engage them, as well as the parents and the young people, as we have this conversation. So I thank you for convening this in a very timely way. I think parents are getting letters in the mail soon to let them know whether or not they've earned a spot in our exam school. So this is very timely, and I thank you for moving quickly on this.
My pleasure. Thank you. Councilor Janey. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Asabi George, and thank you, Councilor Janey, for the partnership as well for both of us. I know it's not only because of the districts we represent, which are predominantly districts of color, that we do this work and we speak of equity and access all the time, but it's also personal for both of us. So thank you for the partnership. Thank you to the advocates for being here who also testify and who have been working on these issues long before I got to the council. Thank you to our school leaders and past headmasters. I see Mr. Kanampasis from Latin School, who is here as well. Thank you for being here. Thank you to BPS, including our superintendent, for being here as well. Given the magnitude of the issue, I know how important it is to you guys. I appreciate you guys also being here. And thank you to my colleagues who are here and those who have been participating in these discussions along the way. I think it's already been said that we have many issues to focus on under the education umbrella: equity, access, access to affordable and high quality early ed and care, open enrollment high schools, selective high schools, making sure they're robust, that students are actually learning in those institutions. The list is long, but today, of course, we'll just focus exclusively on access to our exam schools, all three of them, the O'Brien, Boston Latin School, and Boston Latin Academy. I am a graduate of BPS. I always say that very proudly. I went to 5 BPS schools, including Boston Latin School, and left there to go to Princeton University and UCLA Law School. But some of my peers, including my own twin brother, were not so lucky. My twin brother, who cycled in and out of the criminal justice system, passed away 7 years ago while in the custody of the Department of Correction, which oversees our prisons here in Massachusetts. And when you have something as tragic as that happen, you sort of pause and reflect and look back. And one of the things I noticed that was different was the education we got going through the BPS system. And what was different? The schools we went to, and what was available and afforded me at, say, Boston Latin School was not afforded to him at the Burke High School at the time. When he went to the Burke, it wasn't accredited. They were working really hard, and they're doing incredible work today, and they're in my district, and I work with them a lot. But at the time, it didn't have the resources and all that was available to me at Latin School, and that made a big difference, I think, in our life outcomes. So this work for me is personal as well as professional. My father, who was born in Roxbury in 1933, went to Boston Tech. He graduated in 1951, got accepted to Princeton University, but did not go, ended up going a different route. As the eldest of 7 growing up in Roxbury, he frankly thought, you know what am I going to do down in that campus with a lot of white people? I'm going to have to do something else in order to afford in order to actually gain things for my family. And it was a tough decision I think he made, and one I still reflect on, the choice. I don't attempt to understand it from my perspective, but in looking back, it was really difficult for a black man growing up in the city of Boston back then. But he went to Boston Tech and always talked about the quality of the education he got at Boston Tech. So these institutions are great. BPS is great. The question is, how do we make them available to all students fairly, equitably, and how do we make sure that the process is fair? We have 75% of Boston's student age population is Black and Latino. 40% of the enrollment at these 3 exam schools, I should say, but only 40% of these Black and Latino students are represented at the exam schools, 20% at Latin schools. So we know the numbers. Clearly, we have work to do. This is not a place, and it should not be a space where we blame the school leaders, the teachers, the principals. This is a systems issue. It requires us to change the system. The principals get their list, and they have to just do what they need to do with respect to that list. So how can we change a system and process in order to make sure that everyone has a fair shot? This is also not about pulling apart and blaming certain students. And I'm going to pull one demographic out, our Asian students. While they might be doing well according to these numbers, they still are students of color, and they still are struggling. And actually, in some conversations with some of our headmasters, including Ms. Scarrett from Latin school, we talk about that, the importance of looking at the Asian subgroup, pulling that apart and recognizing that some Asian students are not performing well and sometimes do worse than some of our Black and Latino students. And if we lump them into sort of students of color or pull them out when we see it's fit, we often will lose something in defining the problem. So this is also not about blaming our students, in particular our Asian students, or even our white students or our white parents. It's about how do we shake up a system to make sure that it shows up fairly for everyone. One thing I will add, given where I sit on the council, this is an opportunity for us to have a robust conversation to really look at different strategies, approaches, the advocates, the report that was done recently. There's a lot of ideas, a lot of good ones. Grade configuration, aligning our grade configuration with that of private schools has been talked about for a really long time. The question is, well, what are we going to do about that? Expanding access to the exam itself to make sure all 6th graders have access. When are we going to do that? What does that look like? So the list is long in terms of short-term wins. And then, of course, some long-term solutions. So this hearing is about which of those are we going to do and when and how are we going to get it done, and also exercising the political will to get it done. These are tough conversations that we need to have when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about the history in the city of Boston around race, busing, racism. These are tough conversations. But in order to move forward, in order to move the needle on these important issues, we have to exercise courage and the political will, and we have to be bold. And for that, I'm grateful for the partnership with Councilor Janey in particular, who continues to exercise political will, who is courageous, who is bold. And so thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Councilor Sabi-George, for leading us in this hearing, and look forward to the robust conversation and, of course, more to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Sabi-George, and thank you to Councilor Campbell and to Councilor Janey for your leadership on this important issue. Since I started on the council, I have focused, as it relates to public schools, focused mostly on equal access for all, but especially for students with ELL, those students living in public housing, students living in poverty, and with disabilities. And I'm looking forward to learning more about the process, learning more about what steps can be taken, about how this process can be fairer, and where every student has equal opportunity to attend these great schools. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Wu.
Thank you very much. I want to thank my colleagues for pushing this conversation and for your very eloquent comments about the need for it. I think the district has made some strides already in addressing some of the issues that have been brought up over the last few years, and particularly, as Councilor Janey mentioned, from the students and the youth themselves. And we certainly have a long way to go, but I want to celebrate the expansion of AWC, of ISEE access, of moving towards a commitment to having that, at least for now, that test in every single school and available to every single student, because we have seen the numbers drop off sort of unconscionably if we knew that the demographics of students who were able to go to that test outside of school and juggling a bunch of other commitments, that there have been steps. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank Councilor Campbell for comments on the diversity of the Asian American community. I certainly have heard a lot from the API community on this issue, and this dovetails with a push within our community for data disaggregation overall, that whether it's on educational outcomes or health outcomes or public safety outcomes, there is tremendous disparity, and we need to be, Councilor Flynn's always been a strong voice in making sure that every sub-demographic and every family is addressed in the way that need and the support that they need. I think I want to just share my feeling of conflict, though, about this conversation, and in that I'm feeling very torn about the scope of it, that I agree wholeheartedly with my colleagues that we need to stamp out inequity anywhere we see inequity, and here is sort of a symbol of just how far we need to go as a district and as a city to providing equal access and providing access to opportunity. But especially in the context of the Globe series on valedictorians and how much emphasis there has been on what happens to our, quote unquote, highest performers, I think sometimes as we have that conversation, we have to be extremely, extremely intentional about having the conversation about the district as a whole and every single one of our students. That sometimes if we talk about the exam schools as, one school or three schools that represent quality education, unless we are explicit about pushing the rest of it too, that statement in and of itself can have the implication that we are okay, or at least acknowledging that every other school is not providing the quality education that students deserve, and what are we doing about that? There's also a tension in terms of the seats available at these schools. I think what came through for me, both reading the media reports and some of the other reports that have come out, is that we have to grapple with this as a district about how we expand access, or whether we expand access, and how we guarantee opportunity at these seats at these very special schools that should be celebrated in our district, while acknowledging that every time we take students out of the overall applicant pool and concentrate them together at these exam schools, that is also necessarily concentrating students who don't have these opportunities in other schools. And the statistic that stuck out to me from the Globe report about how I think it was 25% of our students, we'd love to hear more about how the numbers break down from your perspective, but how a very high percentage of our students, relative to other cities, are sort of scooped up for these magnet-type schools, for these exam schools, which leaves a large concentration of students with special needs, with other challenges, who may not have the supports at home to be able to help them take a test and do well, et cetera. Is this the right direction for our district to continue pushing towards expanding access at the, quote unquote, top, or access for performers who are able to jump through these hoops and pass the test and to have good grades? What does that mean that we're left in terms of focus for other students in the district and our other high schools? So I'm very torn about this whole situation. I think this is an extremely important conversation to have, but I just want us to be so intentional about the fact that when we have this conversation, the opportunity cost is that we are not having the conversation about the other schools in the district. And I want to, our chair of education has been really pushing us, and there have been other hearing orders filed about alternative education in other schools, but this is a much larger issue than Boston Latin School or even all three, Boston Latin Academy, and the O'Brien School. This is, I think, the lack of acceptable and quality high school opportunities overall for our district, for our families, and maybe just even the perception that that is the case is extremely destructive for our city and the opportunities and how people make decisions and how they invest in the city and how they feel, whether they feel that this could be a home for them. So high school education overall is something that we really need to tackle. Madison Park is a big piece of that, and I'm glad to see that we're continuing to move on that front. This is kind of another piece of it, but there's a whole big chunk in the middle that I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. Councilor Zakhem.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the co-sponsors, Council President, Councilor Janey, for bringing this important matter forward. I'll be very brief because I know there's a lot to cover here, and as often happens, my good colleagues have covered a lot of the ground. That is why I'm here as well, and why it's such an important issue. I think it really comes down to equity, making sure that while we are proud of our exam schools, of the outcomes for their students, of how impressive an education is provided, we do need to make sure that it's being given with equal opportunity to everyone across the city. And to go off on what Councilor Wu just said, that we cannot forget the other schools in our system, and the fact that the goal for all of us here in city government, in Boston Public Schools, as residents, as people who care about the city of Boston and our future, is that anyone in a Boston public school should be having the same opportunities for success, whether it's because compared to our suburban neighbors, compared to folks who are in the exam schools. We need to do more on that. And it is important framing for this conversation, is that this is not just about these three schools, it's about equity in general and the things that we can be doing. And to my mind, and I always am proud when Boston's a leader on things, including creating the first public schools in this country, the promise of public education, whether it's in Boston or anywhere else, should be about addressing and correcting disparities in our society, about giving everyone else the tools they need to participate fully as adults, as graduates of our public school system. And that's what this really needs to be all about. We need to make sure that while we are continuing to improve everywhere across BPS and in our exam schools, that we are also doing everything we can, and not just for BPS, but us here as city councilors, as advocates, as people in the city of Boston, are being as deliberate as we can, using our limited resources to address issues of equity and access across the board. So I look forward to the discussion and from hearing from our partners at BPS, from the community, about ways we can address this. And I just think it's so important that we're having this conversation. So I, again, want to thank my colleagues for bringing this forward.
Thank you, Councilor Zakhem. So prior to our first panel's presentation, we are going to have some public testimony from Lauren Sampson, who is a civil rights fellow at the Lawyers for Civil Rights. So Lauren, if you'd come up to our public testimony podium, and you will open up your testimony prior to the panel. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you, councilors, for this hearing. As you said, I'm Lauren Sampson. I'm a Civil Rights Fellow at Lawyers for Civil Rights, formerly the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice.
So, Lauren, can I just ask you to lean into the mic a little bit because it's not quite picking you up?
Yes.
There we go. Thank you. Sorry.
Of course. Year after year, month after month, Boston's newspapers of record have reported on the alarming pattern of racial resegregation that has reemerged in BPS and the vast opportunity gap separating Boston's educational winners from the rest of the city. Nowhere is this gap more clear than in BPS's exam schools. Yet the disparities in the makeup of exam school student bodies persists because of a key obstacle to exam school diversity, the admissions process. Lawyers for Civil Rights, the NAACP, the ACLU, the Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts, and Mass Advocates for Children have been working on this issue since May 2017, putting out a report that outlined how neither student grades nor the ISEE are fair or reliable measures of student aptitude, given the enormous variations in grading among Boston's charter, parochial, and traditional public schools, and the failure of the ISEE to test to material taught in BPS classrooms. These problematic criteria disproportionately exclude Black and Latinx students. At the time the report was published, every single majority white neighborhood in Boston had an exam school admission rate above 50%, while all majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods had admission rates below 50%. In 2017 to 2018, Black students were less than 8% of the student body at Boston Latin School, but over 30% of the district as a whole. Latinx students were over 12% of enrollees at BLS, but over 40% of enrollees in the district as a whole. By contrast, white students made up about 45.9% of the BLS student body, but only 14.2% of the district student body. Further, as other counselors have alluded to, although Black and Latinx students bear the brunt of the disproportionate impact, the unavailability of accurate, disaggregated data on Asian American students masks the impact that these policies have had on Asian American subgroups, especially Southeast Asians, and low-income Asian Americans. In other educational and economic contexts, this blindness to the variation among Asian American groups has meant little attention is paid to, for example, the economic vulnerability of Vietnamese Americans, or the fact that wealth inequality is larger for Asian Americans than for whites. The evidence supporting a change to BPS's admission policy for the exam schools continues to mount. In the Rappaport study that others have referenced, the researchers found that Black and Latinx students are both less likely to apply to and be invited to exam schools than their peers. Observing that only some of the ISEE's topics are covered in BPS classrooms, and that many of the tested concepts are accessible only to students who have prepared for the exam outside of school, the researchers concluded that substantial racial gaps existed at every level: ISEE test taking rates, ISEE scores, GPAs, and listing BLS as a first choice. However, these gaps could not be explained by or attributed to underlying differences in academic strength, given that high-achieving Black and Latinx students were still substantially less likely to be invited to exam schools than their peers of similar academic strength, as measured through their MCAS scores. With all this in mind, community groups like ours have held a variety of forums across the city of Boston to solicit input from community stakeholders, parents, students, and educators as to how BPS could change its exam school admissions policy to better reflect the diversity of our city. The four most prominent suggestions drawn from the community members were a proposal that BPS invite a top percentage of students in each public school to attend the BPS high school of their choice, that BPS invite a top percentage of students in each Boston zip code to attend the BPS high school of their choice. Proposals that BPS employ a holistic model to evaluate students individually and seek to admit an academically excellent class that is diverse across multiple dimensions. And proposals that BPS develop a test based on its curriculum, rather than rely on an exam developed for admission to independent schools that disadvantages public school students. All of these proposals were aligned with long-standing guidance from the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice regarding how schools can diversify their student bodies in ways that are constitutionally sound. We know that the racial and socioeconomic makeup of these elite exam schools is not a foregone conclusion. Only 20 years ago, using different admissions policies, the exam schools admitted much more diverse student bodies while maintaining their standards of academic excellence. Although a 1998 court challenge resulted in the termination of the particular policies in use at the time, subsequent cases from the U.S. Supreme Court have confirmed that an academic institution's use of race in admissions decisions is constitutionally permissible because it furthers the compelling interest in obtaining the benefits that flow from a diverse student body. Similarly, race-neutral admissions policies that result in greater diversity, such as admitting top-tier students from each school or each zip code, have also been permitted by courts. In her landmark opinion affirming the compelling interest in educational diversity, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote that in order to cultivate a set of leaders with legitimacy in the eyes of the citizenry, it is necessary that the path to leadership be visibly open to talented and qualified individuals of every race and ethnicity. Boston's exam schools are regarded as some of the best of public education. They are pathways to higher education, to professional accolades, and to civic leadership. These schools must be open to qualified students of every race and ethnicity. We ask that BPS consider implementing the changes put forward by its communities of color that would achieve this result. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. So at this time, I'd like to welcome our Boston Public Schools panel. I'm going to start with the interim superintendent and let you introduce yourself. And as you all take an opportunity to introduce yourself, I'd appreciate you just recognizing the role that you play in the schools. I'd also just like to note, because I think it's wonderful that they're here, we do have the 3 headmasters from Boston's exam schools, Headmaster Freeman Wisdom, Headmaster Scarrett, and Headmaster Uchendu. Thank you all for being here.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank the chair for gathering us today, and particular thanks to Council President Campbell and Councilor Janey for calling the hearing, and to all the councilors present for participating in today's discussion. I'm simply going to kick us off and do some framing and introduce the team, which you're right is large, inclusive of our school and central office leaders who work closely and collaboratively on these issues. And I will hand most of today's conversation over to this tremendous team, but then remain both to listen and learn, and also participate in any questions and conversation following. So I just want to echo much of what was said at the opening of this conversation, which is that this is an extraordinarily important citywide conversation. How we strengthen all of our schools, how we treat and manage equity issues related to a subset of our schools, and how we address opportunity and achievement gaps that create barriers for historically marginalized populations that are incredibly important priorities within our system. All of this is part of the citywide conversation that I think it's incredibly important that Boston continue, because as we know, it has been going on for some time, and continue to advance. So what I want to do, what our presentation aims to do today, is to share some data to provide an update on enrollment trends, so we're all starting from the same place using current data through 2018. Also to outline some of the key challenges that the data tells us we have experienced and have in terms of increasing enrollment, in particular of Black and Latinx students, and then talk about some of the key interventions by the district to address those challenges. And I think it's important to say that diversifying exam school applications, admissions, and enrollment, all elements of the pipeline, are critical, connects directly to the district's priority of closing opportunity gaps. Taken as a whole, even with some recent gains, enrollment trends demonstrate that Black and Latinx students are underrepresented at BPS exam schools, and particularly at Boston Latin School. And I think that's an important fact that we the data points us to, and we can all agree with. And it's also important to point out that it is part of BPS's mission to work to eliminate barriers for Black and Latinx students by applying aggressive, in some cases innovative interventions at every stage of this enrollment, invitation, and application process. So today we want to highlight in particular some deliberate steps that the district has been and is taking. Some are better known, and some are not so. A number are already underway, and some are in development. We'll also discuss what the data is showing us about impact. But since 2016 in particular, and continuing through the current year, during the presentation and discussion, I would draw your attention in particular to 3 big areas of action. One is the exam school initiative, particularly the changes and expansion of program beginning in the summer of 2016. Excellence for All, which also launched in 2016 as a partner and an expanded range of opportunities alongside of the traditional advanced work classes. And Excellence for All is now in its 3rd year of program operation, so there's important data coming out of that. And then the newest decision and announcement this past fall that BPS will begin in fall of 2019 administering the ISEE entrance exam during the school day in all sixth grade classrooms on a voluntary and opt-out basis, so available to all. And this is just the latest in a set of deliberate steps that the district, as well as the 3 individual exam schools, continue to take to address a shared goal of expanding opportunity for all of our students, but in particular paying attention to expanding opportunity for Black and Latinx students and diversifying the exam school pipeline on behalf of all of our students. Before I hand things over to the panel, I do want to make an important note, in particular, to pick up on both Councilor Wu and Councilor Zakim's comments, which is that while we are today talking about exam schools and it warrants a particular conversation, I want to be clear that our focus as a district must and does remain on advancing improvements on behalf of all of our students in all of our schools. That is the true diversification of opportunity to which we all have to hold ourselves accountable. And to that end, just this past Friday, particularly on the topic of high schools, I announced the formation of 6 working groups focused on high school improvement, looking at very deliberate strategies, lots of recommendations, lots of analyses, lots of things that those closest to the work, both our educators and school leaders as well as central office leaders, know, but what BPS needs to do is focus on synthesis of these recommendations and implementation and action planning, which is what those work groups focused on high schools are intended to do. So I'll be happy to talk more of that in subsequent conversations, but I did just want to put a pin that those were all announced on Friday, and that's important work inclusive of all of our high schools as well as the alternative education programs that the district supports. So with that, I am delighted today to be joined by a terrifically thoughtful group, all of whom are deeply personally and professionally committed to this work and have been responsible for some of the important changes that have been made just in the past couple of years. So with me today, beginning to my right, Monica Roberts, our Chief Engagement Officer, Colin Rose, our Assistant Superintendent of the Opportunity Gap, Becky Schuster, our Assistant Superintendent of Equity. We are joined as well by Carolyn McNeil, our ombudsperson, who plays an important role in the exam school admissions process relative to residency. And then we are delighted to have with us the headmasters of all 3 of our exam schools, Tanya Freeman Wisdom of the John D. O'Brien Math and Science School, Rachel Scarrett of Boston Latin Academy, and Chimdi Uchendu, headmaster of Boston Latin Academy. Sorry, did I just reverse those? Boston Latin School, Boston Latin Academy. Let me get that right. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Monica to kick us off.
Good morning, and thank you for having us. Again, my name is Monica Roberts. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer for Boston Public Schools. I'm going to start us off with a bit of a walk through the data, starting with our application trends, going then to the number of invitations and some of those trends, and finally talking about enrollment. So as you look at this chart, you'll see that this, first of all, relates to our 7th grade application pool, that we have seen an increase in the number of Black and Latinx students who are applying to our exam schools. We have, from over the last 4 years, from 2014 to 2018, we have had an increase of 120 Latinx applicants and 131 Black applicants. Our invitation trends also show that there is an increase, particularly among our Black students. So Black students, in terms of the from 2014 to 2018, you'll see that there was an increase from 28% to 33% in terms of those who are being invited to participate and to attend an exam school. There has been a decrease in our Latinx student population, and we believe this is mostly attributed to the jump in student applicants, so the denominator by which we're looking at this, while our Asian and white invitation rates are quite consistent. Moving now to enrollment, since 2014, the percentage of Black students enrolling in our exam schools has trended upward from 16% to 20% over this 5-year period versus 34% overall in the enrollment in the district. This has been the most significant shift in this time across the 3 exam schools. This is then followed by the percentage of Latinx students enrolling trending upward slightly from 21 to 22%. Finally, for our Asian students, we've seen a slight trend downward from 24% to 22%, and for our white students, a slight downward trend as well from 38% to 37%. We're now going to look at enrollment at each of the exam schools, starting with Boston Latin School. At Boston Latin School since 2014, the most significant shift is in the percentage of Latinx students, which has gone from 13% to 17% over the 5-year period, as well as then followed by Black students, which have had a slight trend upward from 10% to 11%. Our Asian student population at this school has trended downward from 25% to 22%, as well as our white student population from 50% to 48%. At Boston Latin Academy, the most significant growth is in the percentage of Black students, which has gone from 18% to 24% from 2014 to 2018. Our Latinx student population has also grown from 22% to 26%. Across the 3 exam schools, the most significant decrease in the percentage of Asian students is at BLA, with a decline from 24% to 14%, and the proportion of white students at the school is steady at 34%. And last, we turn to O'Brien School of Math and Science. At the O'Brien since 2014, the most significant increase in the percentage of Black students is seen here from 30% to 36%. This is also where we see the most significant decrease in the percentage of Latinx students from 40% to 31%. The percentage of our Asian student population at the school is also slightly down from 19% to 17%, while as our white student population in this school has trended slightly upward from 10% to 15%. I'm now going to turn over to Becky Schuster to talk about our work around closing the opportunity gap.
Good morning. My name again is Becky Schuster. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Equity, and I'm pleased to be here today and thank the counselors for continuing to draw our attention to this important issue. When we look at the data as a whole, as we all know, our enrollment trends demonstrate that Black and Latinx students are underrepresented at our exam schools, particularly at Boston Latin School. Our strategy as a district is to eliminate barriers for Black and Latinx students by applying aggressive, innovative interventions at every stage of the application, invitation, and enrollment process, as the interim superintendent was saying. And I do want to highlight that in order to do this work effectively, of course, we need to understand the data well, and the more information that data can give us, the better. I appreciated Lauren Sampson's raising the issue of disaggregation of data earlier, and I am pleased to say that this year, when Boston Public Schools students come to enroll, for the first time they are being asked a long list of potential racial and ethnic identities so that we will no longer be limited to, for example, the term Black, which obviously includes many different kinds of students with different kinds of backgrounds. Same for Hispanic was the term that had been used, Asian, et cetera. So we're giving our students the opportunity to identify much more specifically, and that's going to generate very important information about this topic and many other topics. So what is the challenge? We have identified and begun to address systemic barriers at every phase of the admissions process. That starts with which of our students and families are aware of the opportunities at exam schools, which of our students and families are aware of the admissions process and important deadlines in that process, how students are registered for the ISEE, what opportunities students have to prepare for the ISEE and therefore be more likely to do well on that test, who actually completes the ISEE, which is separate from who registers. Unfortunately, you'll see the data soon that we have some folks who don't show even though they have registered for the test, and that's another barrier. Grading practices, And finally, enrollment preferences, where even when our Black and Latinx students are invited to exam schools, we don't always see them attending. So we'll talk about that as well. And these barriers for Black and Latinx students exist regardless of where they attend elementary school. So whether they attend a BPS elementary school, a charter elementary school, a private elementary school, parochial elementary school, Black and Latinx students experience barriers at each of these stages. I'm going to pass it back to Monica now, who's going to talk more about the outreach process.
So one of the challenges that we've picked up on and heard about is just making sure that families actually know about the opportunity to apply to go to an exam school, but not just that we're sharing that information, but they understand what the opportunity is. So there's been a lot of work done over this last year, thanks to the work of Dr. Rose and the Office of Opportunity Gaps, where we've done more high-touch outreach. So we've done a lot of individual calls to students, and Dr. Rose will talk a little bit more, who we've pre-identified as being highly likely to be able to be successful and be able to enter into an exam school, in terms of giving them individual calls to ask them, have you heard about the exam schools? What do you know? To answer questions, to share more information about the opportunity. I shared with Dr. Rose after his first round of phone calls that there were a couple of young ladies from my church who shared with me that they got the call. They know I work for BPS, and they kind of said, well, we didn't really know what the exam schools were about, but it sounded like something you'd be upset about if we didn't pursue. And so I wanted him to know that the individual phone calls were working, and so that high touch seems to be providing some movement in the right direction. In addition, we know that there needs to be much clearer messaging about what the opportunity is, what it means, what this will feel like for our students, and also in terms of the process, timeline, and benefits. We have heard from a number of families of color being unclear about some of the steps in the process, so we're working and have been working to make sure that it's much more clear and that the information is accessible in many more places. We reached out to partners, asking them to share information, going to libraries, and looking at more ways that we can get this out. Our goal for next year is to really leverage more ethnic media opportunities to share this information as well. We've also extended the proof of residency deadline because we've learned that this has particularly impacted our students of color. And so this provides more runway for students to get into a welcome center and provide the information needed that the families will have to produce in order to sit for the exam and be eligible for entrance. There's also been lots of work by our individual exam schools. Our headmasters have really taken a lead in doing this work, and so I'm going to turn to them, and we'll take them in order, starting with Headmaster Chimi and Chindu, and then we'll be followed by Headmaster Scarrett, and then Headmaster Freedom Wisdom to talk about what they're doing in their individual schools.
Hi, Chindu. So we're trying to do a number of things at Boston Latin Academy to increase outreach to the broader community. Some of the things we've been doing, we do neighborhood meetings. It's a little tricky because it's dependent on parents in our building who are willing to host other families at their homes or at various sites around their neighborhood. We also do school tours, visitation days. At any point, you can go on our website, link up, sign up for a school tour, and we provide students and ambassadors to walk you around the school and do visitations. One of the things we did enjoy is the exam school initiative through the work of Colin Rose and his team. They built it out, increased the diversity of students that attend that meeting, and we actually get to talk to students at that point there too. Another thing that we are discussing right now, I know we've had emails about it, is trying to reach students in the younger grades, as early as 5th grade. Because we do school showcases, but it's really towards students who typically they already know whether they're going to be able to get into BL, one of the 3 exam schools. We do showcases at our school too. 3 of them. I try to stagger them, some in the morning, some in the afternoon, and some late afternoon around 6 to 9. Another thing that we do is we do have Prospective Students Day. So when students do know that they're getting in, we do try to reach out to We do have people who call the parents of the prospective students when we get the list to make sure that we're reaching everybody so that they come to these meetings, and we do talk about a diversity at the school and things like that.
It'll go on.
Good morning, everybody. Rachel Scare at Boston Latin School. Boston Latin School is definitely enriched by a diverse and engaged student body and would be further enriched by further progress in this area. While we're proud to be a school representing every neighborhood in Boston, numerous countries of origin, and as many as 42 languages spoken at home, we know that our racial demographics do not reflect those of the Boston Public Schools or the City of Boston. We also know that many elementary and middle schools in Boston are underrepresented in our student body. As such, we've engaged in deliberate, intentional outreach efforts to underrepresented students, both in terms of race as well as sending school. Together with our Equity Committee, the Boston Latin School Association, our Black Alumni Advisory Council, and our parent group Families for Equity and Diversity, we've intensified and accelerated efforts to increase the number of Black and Latinx students, as well as students from underrepresented schools. Expanding diversity is not simply a matter of connecting with a range of prospective families, but fostering a school culture that's inclusive and welcoming. And I'll talk a little bit about school culture at a later point, but right now I'll just share the multi-pronged approach that we've taken to outreach. And when I say multi-pronged approach, I'm referring to work we do to reach prospective families both before they've taken the ISEE, then when they've become applicants to the exam schools by taking the test, and finally to students who've been invited to BLS specifically. So for prospective students and families, we go far beyond the 3 required tour dates. We offer about 15 tours annually during hours most convenient for families. We have over 100 trained student tour guides who speak 16 languages total, not individually. To promote school visits, we've distributed flyers in English and Spanish to community centers and libraries. We've sent personal emails to all elementary and K-8 principals. We actually host Stepping Stone 1 or 2 Saturdays a year. It's a program that prepares young people for exam and independent schools. They live at Boston Latin School, Boston Latin Academy on the other Saturdays. And while they are on campus, we add special activities and tours for them and their families. This past December, all of the 5th graders from Russell Elementary School, their teachers and principals spent the morning at BLS attending classes and performances. It was a great experience, and we plan to use the model for future 5th grade class visits. And we've also gone on the road some, participating in off-site open houses, including KIP and Stepping Stone, and bringing our seniors to read to children at Shaw Elementary School, and our STEP squad to perform for children at the Sumner. Once students have taken the exam, with support from BPS, we sent emails and letters by post directly to Black and Latinx students who took the ISEE, inviting them to take tours. To reinforce, we sent individual emails to principals, asking them to encourage their families to visit BLS before the school ranking process. That's where you choose whether you want what school you'd like to rank first, second, or third in the exam school process. And as a result, there was a definite increase in the number of students from underrepresented schools who came to take tours. After invites from BPS have been sent to families, we hold a phone-a-thon. BLS staff and parents call targeted groups of parents or guardians of invited students to welcome, offer guidance, and personally invite them to attend one of our open houses for newly invited students. We've found that that personal touch has made a difference. Also, the Black Alumni Advisory Council sends a welcome letter and package to Black invitees, and BAAC members are on hand at the open house to greet families. This engagement with invited students is especially significant, as the fastest way to impact the demographics of BLS is simply for every student of color who is invited to accept a seat at the school. This year, we're reaching out to another valued and sometimes overlooked partner, 5th grade teachers. Recognizing that 5th grade is pivotal, we're working with the district on a special event for 5th grade teachers on Thursday, March 21st. At that time, BPS officials and exam school headmasters, so all of us, will be there to talk with 5th grade teachers about the application process and their key role. We'll also ask for their input in creating more visiting opportunities for their students. And finally, we're always working to improve our outreach efforts, and to do so, we rely on students and families for their input. We'll continue to make follow-up calls in June to the families of underrepresented students who decline a seat at BLS, as we want to find out what influenced their decision. We've found in past years when we've done this that most students are choosing highly selective independent schools when turning down a BLS seat. It should be noted that any student who ranks BLS as a preference other than first choice will not be invited to BLS, considering the school's high demand. I mention that to say that if a student ranks another exam school as first but has scores higher than every applicant to BLS, they will be admitted to their chosen school, and we would not have the opportunity to engage with them after invites are sent out. It's difficult to quantify how many students fall into that category. But we also want to know what does make students excited to choose BLS. So tomorrow, all of our students will take a survey designed by our equity committee to find out why they chose BLS and what supports have had an impact on their transition to the school. Thanks.
All right, good morning. I am Tanya Freeman Wisdom, headmaster of the O'Brien. The first thing I want to note is that 75% of the BPS students identify as Black and/or Latinx, and at the O'Brien, 67% of our student body identify as Black and Latinx. So it's important to make that note when we think about the characteristics of, well, the demographics at each of the exam schools. Some of the outreach methods that we use, we attend the Showcase of Schools. It's primarily run by our parents. When there, we do collect the names of families and follow up with phone calls. One piece of data that we do have is that some of the families, they don't have the information about the admissions process. And this is also manifests itself through our online portal, through our website. We receive a lot of emails and they're saying we want to send our child to your school. So they do not have the information that they need about the admissions process to exam schools. We also hold school preview sessions. These are held at different times of the day to accommodate different families. This includes a student-led tour, an overview of our school's programming, as well as a Q&A session. We also schedule individual meetings with families who cannot make any of those times. We also hold invitee night, and this occurs after people get their letters letting them know that they've been admitted to an exam school. This is a huge event. We have, over the last couple of years, maybe more than 500 to 600 families have shown up to this. A main feature of this night is our parent-to-parent session. We allow our parents to lead it, to ask questions, to respond to questions that many families have regarding what's it like to be a student at an exam school and things to expect once they're there. During this time, we also conduct a school tour, and we present an overview of our school's programming. After that, we also offer shadow days to students, so they can contact our guidance counselors, and they do set up the opportunities for young people to come and shadow students at the O'Brien. We also make a lot of calls to families after we receive the invitation list, primarily to those families who have not yet accepted their seats. One of our findings is that many of the students who don't accept the seats, they are staying at their charter schools. And this is manifests itself through the expansion of charter schools at the high school level. So the students who don't come, they usually stay where they are. We also attend the Exam School Initiative Open House at BLS. We bring students and other staff members to talk about our school's programming and just the diversity of the O'Brien. We also hold a summer orientation for our students who have accepted their seats. And the reason why I mentioned this is because this is another opportunity for us to make outreach to those families who have not yet accepted their seats. And by doing this, we have gotten a couple more families to actually attend the O'Brien. So we hold a 2-day orientation for our grade 7 students and then a week-long orientation for our grade 9 students. And other than that, we have our website, and we have the email portal that, families can reach out to us on. And these are the primary ways that we reach out to families. Thank you.
Good morning.
Dr. Rose, before you start, I just want to make sure to welcome Councilor Flaherty, who joined us a little bit ago, but I didn't want to interrupt presentations
no
until
problem.
now. Thank you.
I'm Colin Rose from the Opportunity Gap Office over at BPS. Beyond what was just spoken about around letting people know about the process and the availability of exam schools, I wanted to briefly talk about the actual registration process of the IECE and some of the problems with it and what we've done to try to address it. basically, if you look at the numbers of those who register for the ICE, there's disproportionality, where white and Asian students, in their percentages, far outweigh the Black and Latinx students who are applying and registering for the ICE. So one of the new interventions that we took up 2 years ago was pre-registering students. Anybody that's been school-based before understands kind of how arduous that process of registration can be. You have a slip of paper that has to go home in a student's backpack, come back to the school, from the school get to central office, a ticket goes to the home from central office. And so we wanted to make the process more streamlined for students who we really want to take the test. And so what we did was pre-register around 1,000 students based on GPA, ELA, or math MCAS. The demographics of those that were pre-registered, the last couple of years were in between 50 or 55% Latinx, between 25 and 30 percent Black, around 10% white, and 10% Asian. There was a dip last year in the percentage of Black students who were pre-registered. So we're trying to figure out what happened there so that when we pre-register students next year, that doesn't happen. I'm going to hand off to Becky to talk a little bit about attendance at ICE once people are registered.
As they prepare to enter into those slides, I just want to point out that now what Colin and Becky will be stepping us through are some of the more recent steps the district has taken, again, beginning in 2016. So when Colin talks about the ISE pre-registration, that began in 17-18.
2 years ago, yep.
And so this data is important because it shows what we can start to move when we take these kinds of deliberate steps.
So in addition to the barriers that we've seen to students registering for the ISE, we have also seen disproportionality in terms of who registers and yet does not actually complete the test on the testing date. So when you look at the statistics involving who registered for the test, who then completed the test versus who did not show for the test, we can again see gaps, opportunity gaps for our Latinx and Black students. So for example, for 2017 test in November of 2017, you can see that of the Latinx students who were registered, 38% did not show up the day of the test. And we can imagine, while we don't know exactly what those barriers were, we can imagine what some of those barriers are in terms of, for example, just on a most simple level, what public transportation is like to get to the test site. Similarly, for Black students in the first year, 39% of data here of 39% did not show the day of the test, 40% the second year. Whereas for white and the Asian students, the number of no-shows is much lower. For white students, 14% and then 19%, and for Asian students, holding steady at 7%. So this shows the importance of the district taking action in addressing the disproportional barrier to attendance at the ICE. So here are some interventions that we have implemented. First, and we're very pleased that this coming November, the ISE will be administered at every school with every BPS school with a 6th grade during the school day. This will, we hope, eliminate many of the barriers for students who have registered for the test actually completing the test. It represents a significant investment in the BPS proposed budget, $364,000 allocated to ensure we have sufficient actual fit tests for our increased number of test takers, support for school-based testing, increased outreach to families. We want to make sure that as we make this change, we do it very well and take into account the particular logistics at every school. Another intervention is continuing to pre-register students based on the district analysis that Colin mentioned earlier, but any student can opt in to the ISE. Students may opt out of school-based testing. Of course, we do have some students who feel that they are taking more tests than they need to and would prefer to opt out in general. But in specific, they can opt out of school-based testing and instead take the free Saturday exam or use a private test facility if they prefer. We will also continue to offer disability accommodations for the ICE at a central location on Saturday. The impact of this pilot on grade 6 participation rates will help us determine whether we should also expand a similar program to, for example, 8th grade when we see more entrance into exam schools, particularly the O'Brien. I think that we are anticipating that students will benefit from testing in a more familiar environment where they're already accustomed to the testing protocols at their schools, where in many cases we'll be able to provide disability accommodations at their schools. And we hope that families and students will be less inconvenienced by weekend testing, though they still have the option for that Saturday test if they prefer.
So beyond access to the actual test, we wanted to talk a little bit about preparation for that test, the ICE. And again, the problem is disproportionality in those who are preparing for that test. 3 years ago, when I came into my position, I looked at our exam school initiative, which is a free 2-week test prep program over the summer and Saturdays moving into the test. Only 25% of those that were taking advantage of that program were Black and Latinx students. So beyond even the private classes and tutors that others access, our population of students within the BPS, there was major disproportionality within that one program. And so we set upon a path to dramatically expand the access and then change the demographics of that program. So we did multiple things to improve that program. Extended recruitment to all elementary schools. There were a pocket of 10 to 15 elementary schools that were really taking full advantage of this program, and many from what people would call the Circle of Promise neighborhoods that were not. I think there were only 1 or 2 schools that were sending more than 3 students out of any of the schools in Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester. And so what we did was give seats to those schools automatically, above and beyond those that were traditionally invited. We also made access to the actual program easier for students that didn't have things like parents to drive them there, right? You're talking about 5th grade students, coming from Mattapan all the way to BLS where the program is held. Many parents are not going to be willing to put their students on MBTA to get there. So we provided transportation starting 3 years ago. We also started providing breakfast and snack. Food was not being administered during that program. And then a lot of support around outreach and making sure parents knew about it and that schools knew about it. So the results of that, we've tripled the number of Black and Latinx students in that program and doubled the percentage. And through that program, we're seeing major results for the students that are moving through. And so 44% of the students that we actually recruited to the exam school initiative that prior to that would not have been eligible for that program actually matriculated into an exam school. And so it works when you put students in front and they take full advantage of that program. Last year, we even piloted a section for 8th graders for 9th grade admissions. It was a small cohort, but we'll see this year when we see the results of who got in during the 9th grade, how effective that was. Beyond test prep, I think a larger conversation is around preparation throughout elementary school to take on the rigors of an exam school. So historically, programs that have aimed to do this, specifically advanced work class. Oh, sorry. I'm dealing with 2 pieces of technology, sorry. Historically, programs that have tried to attempt to do this, again, have been disproportionately white and Asian, our advanced work class stream. And so Again, 3 years ago, we looked at that as a problem and said, how do we flip this narrative and how do we flip this model so that we're providing high rigor, culturally affirming instruction and programming to all of our students in elementary school. And so that's where Excellence was kind of born out of. Excellence for All was born out of. Currently, Excellence for All serves 800 students, a little bit over 800 students from 4th to 6th grade. Under our pillars of rigorous instruction, quality enrichment, culturally and linguistically sustaining practices with social emotional learning, executive function, and personalized learning. Currently, we are in 16 schools with that. These are the proportions of students served in both AWC and Excellence for All as compared to our district. And as you can see in these bar graphs, Excellence for All really is truly representative of our district and opening opportunities for students to higher rigor, better enrichments, and what we believe is a model for how elementary schools should be programmatically across the district. And we'll be looking at ways to take components of that and spread it across the district. Final thing that I'll talk about is our grading practices. And a lot of people point to some of the difficulties because grades are 50% of the admissions process to exam schools. There are concerns around things like grade inflation outside of BPS and even within some BPS schools. It's different schools have different gauges on what our grading policy was. And in 5th and 6th grade, we moved from numbers in 5th grades 1 through 4 to letter grading in 6th grade. And so to try to get a handle of this, we actually did some studying ourselves in the district and surveying of teachers. And so we created a working group that surveyed teachers, had central administration as part of it, and talked about the current 5th grade 1 through 4 grading scale. Many people pointed to this as an inequity for BPS students, assuming because when you read the 1 through 4 grading scale in 5th grade, it's very much competency-based. It talks about 4s as being above and beyond grade level, and so the concern was that students that might get an A or even an A- were getting docked and hit with a 3, which would convert to a number 9 in the admissions process, where a 4 is a 12. And outside of BPS, when we're not using a 1 through 4 scale, the concern was that any A student outside of BPS was getting that 4 and getting that 12. So we talked for a while around changing A through F, but what we actually learned when we started surveying teachers is they weren't operationalizing 1 through 4 to the letter of that competency. So most of our teachers in 5th grade, and we surveyed over 60% of them, we're actually using 4 as a proxy within the A range, which actually, if we keep 1 to 4, is a net benefit to our students. If we were to change to A through F, an A plus would be a 12, an A would be an 11, an A- would be a 10, and so on. At this time, anything in the A range is being scored as a 4, which then would equate to the top score, which would be a 12 when we look at admissions. And so rather than change that scale, what we did was create a document and a series of meetings to calibrate around that, to make sure that every 5th grade teacher knows that's the way that we are calibrated as a district, that anything within the A range should be a 4 and shouldn't be a 3. And so that communication has gone out to all 5th grades across our district and will continue to be our message moving forward. I'm going to pass this on to Becky to talk about enrollment preferences once the testing process is over.
So as Headmaster Scarrett mentioned earlier, another point where we see disproportionality is that some Black and Latinx students whose scores and grades would qualify them for invitation to Boston Latin School opt not to attend. And we have some sense of that there are a variety of reasons for that, and in some cases it may be because they perceive Boston Latin School to not be welcoming or supportive. Obviously there was a lot of publicity around challenges regarding the racial climate at the school in January of 2016. And therefore, we may have some students opting out for that reason, as well as invitations to highly competitive independent schools, et cetera. In terms of intervening in that, at that point in the process, the outreach that Boston Latin School has been engaging in, I think, is one very important aspect of that. And the second is some very deliberate efforts to shift the culture at Boston Latin School. And I'd like to give a shout out to former interim headmaster Kantam Pasas and interim assistant headmaster Jerry Howland, who are here today, who started that work in 2016. And of course, Headmaster Scarrett is doing an extraordinary job of continuing it. And the Office of Equity is proud to support that work. And I'm going to turn the mic back to Headmaster Scarrett for a few minutes to talk about some of the work at Boston Latin School around shifting the racial climate.
Thanks, Becky. I'll just take a couple of minutes here to talk about some of the programming and initiatives at BLS, but it should really be noted that making a school welcoming, inclusive, and warm is not something that can be done just through clubs, events, and programs. We really invite those who haven't been to BLS or haven't been to BLS recently to come visit and get a feel for the school and our everyday activities. Our students of color are deeply invested in their school and have significant impact on the school's culture as a whole. Our racial and cultural affinity groups, which are student-run with the assistance of faculty advisors, play a major role in providing students with spaces to discuss issues that affect their communities and also creating educational programming for the student body as a whole. These groups include BLS Black, Black Leaders Aspiring for Change and Knowledge, TAG, a longtime program serving Latinx students primarily, MESA, Middle Eastern Students Association, Asia, Asian Students in Action, the Vietnamese Student Society, among many others. And it's important, I wanted to mention the Vietnamese Student Society because while our Asian community isn't necessarily underrepresented, there is incredible diversity of background, languages, and experiences within the group that is important to understand and differentiate, and I'm glad that's been mentioned here today. All of these affinity groups put together showcases for their peers that serve not just to entertain but to educate. Just this past weekend, BLS Black put on their annual showcase to culminate Black History Month. The Vietnamese Tet Festival was last month, the Tag Show is in April, and Asian Night is in May. We have also begun to engage in work specifically targeted to our Black and Latino boys, starting a Young Men of Color group this year that meets both on and off-site during the school day and after school with the support of volunteer mentors, many of whom are BLS alums. It's been extraordinarily successful in its short time thus far, and we look forward to growing the program. We're appreciative to the Office of Opportunity Gaps for their support as we've launched this programming. We've also identified that students entering BLS in 9th grade need unique supports to assist them with the transition to BLS. So we've instituted year-long programming to familiarize them with the school and to offer the expertise of upperclassmen who also started BLS in grade 9. While not specific to any one demographic, we also have a peer mentoring program in place in which all 7th graders participate. Multiple times in their first year, they meet with juniors and seniors who walk them through various skills that will be of use to them at BLS, from self-advocacy to social media safety. We've also expanded upon traditions at BLS, such as our annual program for the Martin Luther King holiday. Students serve on the planning committee with me for this event, and all students attend the MLK program. The auditorium event is paired with full-day programming all over campus, including workshops on social justice by members of our faculty, sessions about Dr. King's legacy by members of his fraternity at BU, and an interactive workshop for all 8th graders on implicit bias by a Tufts professor who's also a BLS parent. This year, we explored the topic of what it means to be an ally in today's society. Finally, we aim to foster a culture where if a student experiences something that they believe compromises an environment of inclusiveness and celebration of differences, they will feel comfortable coming to us and feel confident in our follow-up around those issues. We work in close partnership with the Office of Equity when those situations arise, and we proactively conduct sessions with all of our students about their responsibilities as members of the BLS community to be upstanders. Thanks.
Thank you, Headmaster Scarrett. I'm going to pass it back to Monica Roberts, who's going to talk about enforcement of residency requirements, and this is our last portion of our presentation today.
you have the slide. So in terms of, one of the other issues we've been trying to look at is the issue of residency and having non-Boston residents attend our exam schools. So we've done a lot of work in partnership with our ombudsperson, Ms. Carolyn McNeil. My office, the Welcome Centers, does the work of actually verifying residency with families, and so we actually create a flag list that then goes to the ombudsperson's office of students who do not attend a school in Boston at the time that they come to verify residency. So it means that they have been able to verify their residency, but their school is not located within Boston, and so that creates our first flag list. For the 1920 school year, so for this round of residency verification process for next school year, we had 107 students who's on our flag list, 29 of whom were confirmed to be living outside the district and therefore will not be considered for exam school admissions. We've also made some shifts to our policy in terms of residency, and the first update, these were made in October 2018, is that students who apply to take the ISEE and list a public school that is not in Boston during the residency verification process will require a letter from the superintendent of that city or town stating that they are aware that the student is a Boston resident prior to taking the exam in November. So this is just one way of our doing another verification check that the student is in fact a Boston resident. Their current district is verifying that they do believe the student to be a Boston resident. Secondly, we also updated that policy to reserve the right to request additional proofs of documentation if a student and their family has been previously found to be in violation of the district's residency policy and are re-registering their child in the Boston Public Schools. So this is just for those who have already violated that may require additional information and proof that they in fact are Boston residents. So we are continuing to do this work. We have a full-time investigator position that also follows up on tips from schools that may come from other parents, teachers, our entire body, but there's a lot of work that is done to really suss out and determine where we have residency infractions and then to correct those. And so I think with that, I will end there, and we can answer more questions about the residency piece if you like, but I'll turn it over to our superintendent.
Thank you, all of you, for the work that you do to contribute to this conversation. And I just want to recap. We welcome the conversation and questions. I think what's important about today's presentation is to reflect the fact that this conversation about how do we increase access, the suggestions that have come from those who are close to the work, those who are inside the system, but also many community advocates, reports, and analyses that a number of these steps are practically underway, and some of them just beginning this year. And so I think that's a hopeful sign that as the broader community engages in a conversation about how do we want to approach our exam schools, what are the strategies, it is incumbent on BPS to then assess how we can practically implement those. And so I want to point in particular not only to the exam school initiative strategies, notably the pre-registration, as well as the careful attention to access barriers to participation in the exam school initiative, but as well as the launch of Excellence for All, which I think is not as well understood about the breadth of that program, which now exceeds significantly the size of the traditional advanced work class program. And then most recently and currently underway, since they are the topic of recent analyses and recommendations, is the working group around grading, which is critical, that is now already underway and will impact the consistency and reliability of grading for next year's invitations. And then the exam school, the ISEE in the classroom, which, as Monica mentioned, we announced last fall, we have built into the budget that is currently being proposed for FY20, which will enable that to happen in fall of 2019. So all of these are ways of indicating that as we build collective ownership and understanding of steps that can be moved forward, we are actually making those happen And I think that that is a continuing conversation that Boston needs to have about what additional steps can be taken, but we will closely assess the impact of these big changes, and the ISE in the classroom is a big one. And so we will be putting a lot of our energy into that rollout for this coming year to make sure we get it right, to work carefully with all schools so that there aren't unintended consequences, and then to assess that, the impact that that has on the expansion of opportunity. And we welcome taking the same thoughtful lens to feasibility and implementation to additional ideas and recommendations that may come out of this and ongoing conversations. So with that, we'll be happy to answer questions now or later.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to just set a timer for myself and my colleagues for our questions, just because we will be here for a little while if we don't do that. So I just want to thank you all for your presentation today and your availability for this, this question and answer. I especially want to thank our headmasters for taking time away from where I know you all three think you should be, which is in your school communities. So I appreciate your time here today. And I want to reiterate what a number of us said, that the focus really should be on how do we improve access and quality of education to all of our high schools. And one piece that we didn't touch on in the presentation is the role of some of our other application high schools have, and how that might impact either the decision to enroll at one, accept invitation to one of our exam schools, or not apply at all. So I don't know whether or not we have any of the information on the data for application schools for today. And then my second part related to that question is kids that are invited to any of our exam schools, where are they attending instead? So we hear a little bit about charter schools, selective private schools, but do we break down that data at all to see where our kids are going that have been invited to one of our exam schools? So I'm not sure if you have any information or response to either of those questions at this time.
So just on the topic of other selective enrollment high schools, we did not bring that data today. That is data, and any specific questions, if you'd like to submit them to us, that we're happy to follow up and answer. I will mention that the notion of balancing our open enrollment high schools, our selective enrollment high schools, our exam high schools, and our alternative education programs is an active conversation that many of you have heard us address, particularly with regard to Build BPS. It is an important issue. It particularly impacts not only the concentration of need, but notably the equity of program placement for some of our most vulnerable learners, including our English learners and our students with disabilities. We're actively addressing this. It is one of the core principles of school organization under Build BPS, so I just want to put that out there, but we'd be happy to answer any specific questions about current enrollment, but it is an important and broad topic.
I also, related to enrollment or choosing to accept invitation, is the role of any of our kids who are receiving, or either on an IEP or in a 504 plan, and what, if they are accepting invitation, what that rate is, and then if any of them are attending and then withdrawing from any of our exam schools because the needs haven't been met at the exam schools. We've received phone calls in my office about that. And I think that's because the special ed services and support services aren't happening in a satisfactory way at the exam schools. It's important that we also follow up on that. I do have more questions, but I'm going to move on to my colleagues. I'll start with Councilor Janey.
Thank you. So first, thank you for this presentation. Thank you all for being here. I failed to mention that 2 of the 3 exam schools are in my districts, so I am very proud of that point. I know I'm on a timer, and a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues will have questions, so I'll try to keep my questions very brief. So one thing that I'm really encouraged by is the amount of work that has been ongoing since I was much more active in these conversations with all of you and with all of the folks from the civil rights organizations represented here today. So to hear about the expansion of the Exam School Initiative and what that is doing, very encouraging. One of the things that I took from your presentation was real intention around identifying barriers and trying to then remove those barriers. A quick question. I know of the 3 exam schools, one accepts 9th grade students, the other 2 do not, right? So O'Brien will accept?
It's a matter of how many seats are available.
Tanya, do you want to answer that for us, please?
Grade 10?
Yes.
So is O'Brien the only one that does grade 10?
Yes.
And how, if they all accept grade 9, are there seats available across the board, or are some of the schools, or 1 or 2 of the schools kind of already filled?
50% of the O'Brien's graduating class enters in grade 9. So we have fewer sections of grades 7 and 8 than the other 2 exam schools. So they may, they can speak on their own behalf in terms of the percentage of students who enter in grade 9, but 50% of our school's graduating class enters in grade 9, and yes, we do accept students in grade 10 as well.
Thank you for clarifying that. So for the other 2, are you able to say 50% come, or no? I assume it's a much smaller number that are coming from 9th grade, yes?
Yeah, it's much smaller for us. We admit over 400 7th graders, or enroll over 400
And then
7th
they just
graders,
move through.
and then we enroll about 50 9th graders. So it's a considerable difference in size. And fortunately, our retention is extremely high, and so the attrition wouldn't warrant an admissions in grade 10.
No, and it's good that.
Yeah, which is a good thing.
Right, exactly. So I'm going to shift a little bit. So I assume yours is similar to?
Similar.
Okay.
310 in 7th grade, and then about 9th grade. We have a big jump previous year, but typically it's around 90 students in 9th grade.
And so one of the things that you're doing as well is you're doing the test this fall in schools, which I think is huge. So in terms of if I can't get to the space, if the space is unfamiliar, if I'm on the T, you remove a lot of those barriers. So I'm excited about that happening. I noticed that you're doing an opt-in. Do you want to talk a little bit why opt-in versus opt-out?
The thought, we're in mid-process, but the thought is to have a similar process around pre-registering students that have a high potential of making it into the exam school, and then have an opt-in for those that aren't on that list, and then also an opt-out for those that don't want to take the test at their school site.
And if I could just amplify on that, we're attempting to be conscious of the fact that we're introducing another test for students, and so I think it's with that reason that the team has thought carefully about this. And the other is that I just want to highlight, both for the pre-registration and also for the test, just to put a fine point on what Colin, Dr. Rose was just mentioning, is that in order to identify students, BPS has begun using a broader set of criteria. So we're no longer relying, those of you who are familiar with the Terra Nova test that kids take in the 3rd grade that sends you into advanced work class, but looking at a range of MCAS statistics disaggregated as well as grades to cast the broadest possible net to identify students who would then be strong. That's the opt-in part.
And what is the charge of the working group looking at grading? Because that's another thing that you're looking at. So we know that grade inflation is happening in other schools outside of BPS, and one of the things that you're trying to do to address that is to make sure that students who would be, let's say, an A+ average are receiving that A+ average and being consistent there. What is the charge of the working group? And I got one more. One more after that.
Yeah, I think that the charge of the working group was to make sure that we weren't disadvantaging our students, right? And so the thought actually going into doing the work was everybody saying, let's go to A through F in fifth grade. When we actually dug into the data, when you talk to the teachers, it was going to be less advantage for our students to go to an A through F system, just by the way that people were operationalizing 1 through 4. We believe that people were creating 4 as almost an unreachable unreachable mark, which is not what's actually happening on the ground. And moving to an A through F system, you have A pluses, you have A's, you have A minuses. Right now, if we norm, anything from an A minus to an A plus equates to a 4, which gives you 12 points towards
I
admissions.
understand why that is and why you're doing that, and that's important. I think I'll just end the first round here and then come back for additional questions that I have, which are many, and that you've heard from Lawyers Committee, who has been engaged in this work for a number of years, like I have been, and others, and they're doing, they've been doing these community sessions, which I think are important to really make sure that they're engaging, former students, parents, the whole nine. And I'm curious, so I know maybe it's your first time hearing there are 4 recommendations here, but these are not new conversations. These are conversations that have been being had for years now, at least the last couple of years. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on some of so there were 4 recommendations that they put out there. Maybe you, Superintendent, if you could just kind of give some sort of response to those 4 recommendations, that would be helpful.
And I assume the 4 recommendations you're referring to are the idea of a top percentage of BPS students by zip code or Boston residents by zip code, a top percentage by elementary school, a holistic model that ranks students using a variety of factors, and then a BPS-specific test.
Yes.
And I would add to that some of the conversation we've been having, again, long-standing conversations and suggestions, both from the community, also backed by research. So the look at grading, the ISE administration in the classroom, and then the notion of MCAS versus an external test. So we have been looking at all of those. And what I would say is, at least initially, our approach is some of these are complicated proposals that really involve a very large citywide conversation that and also looks into logistically, legally, all of those things. How would you make some of the big changes, say, for example, around percentages, while those conversations are happening? And we think those are important conversations. Our strategies have been aimed at things that we can do right now to address reducing barriers and increasing access. So that's why we've focused initially on the grading, on the ISE in the classroom. We are also looking at the possibility of a different test beside from ISE, but because we prioritized the in-school administration first for this initial year, the company that does ISE is the most able to help us with in-school administration, but we certainly are keeping on the table the possibility of a different exam, whether or not that falls under a BPS specific, but basically looking at the different providers on the market. And then the same is true for looking at things like what would happen if we weighed MCAS versus an independent exam. How would we then meet the needs of students citywide, not all of whom who take MCAS, and which is still a responsibility of the exam school admission process. So I think while those conversations continue, and I think they're all valid conversations that Boston needs to have, not just here, but also the school committee, the city council, and the broader community and constituencies of the 3 exam schools as well. These are the steps that we felt we could immediately move to and begin that implementation rather than waiting for a final set of recommendations and make those changes now.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to hold my colleagues to their 5 minutes because we do have 2 more panels.
Yes, thank you.
Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Sabi George. I guess a couple of comments before going into a few questions. First of all, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the work that you continue to do. Thank you for the disaggregation of data along racial groups and subgroups. Excited to see what that turns into. Very important, and not just for the Asian community, like you said, for the Black community, the Latinx community. The more we know about the specifics of those groups, the better we can be in responding to their needs. So thank you for that. I think another thing that is important that Dr. Wisdom pointed out is whatever response that we have with respect to this issue, whether it's short-term or long-term, I think we need to pull apart the data for the individual schools themselves. Each school is different. Each school has different diversity numbers, different students of color, different numbers of students of special ed, you name it. And I think we need to pull that apart and then have a response that speaks to each school differently. We might find that the solutions for Latin school are different than what we need at Latin Academy and O'Brien. So I just wanted to put that out there. As we continue this conversation, it's important that we also disaggregate the story for each of those institutions, while we also need to couple it with rebranding the institutions. One of the things we talk about, yes, I'm a product of Latin school. I love Latin school. I will always love Latin school. The O'Brien, formerly Tech, Latin Academy are also excellent institutions that often don't get the credit and the credit they're due for the incredible work they do in educating our student population. So what would it mean for us in this conversation to acknowledge that, but the district and those in the community to continue to put at the forefront this rebranding of these institutions as all excellent institutions. So I wanted to put that out there. And yes, we know this work, this conversation has to be coupled with not only what's happening in open enrollment high schools, our selective high schools, but also this idea around culture within these institutions. We need to put a mirror up, frankly, right here in government, right? We need to talk about culture. We need to talk about early ed. We need to talk about 5th grade, 6th grade, even before then, because all of that informs what we're talking about here. So I think just putting a pin in that, because that's what I heard today. Couple of quick questions on the low-hanging fruit, and I'll come back to sort of the long-term solutions that are out there or ideas. Clearly, family outreach, engagement, crucial, key. Our parents knowing how this process works and us proactively reaching out to them. So I just want to say, you know, who's owning that? What's the funding look like? I mean, clearly the schools themselves are doing incredible work, but they have a lot to do. So how might we own this centrally? How do we outreach to every single family? Is it at the same time that we're doing the ISEE for every 6th grader? Are parents getting a packet before then? At what point do they get information about this exam school process? I imagine if you were coming into one of our welcome centers, in that package should be information about this and a follow-up call specifically to students who we are trying to be intentional around. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that family outreach and getting that information to parents. And lastly, just one quick question for this round, because I'm sure this might beep soon. ISEE now available for all 6th graders. There's been miscommunication around that. When we say all 6th graders, is it all 6th graders that would be taking this exam? And if not, then who amongst those 6th graders are actually going to be sitting for the new ISEE that is going to be rolled out within schools, not just on the weekend? Thank you.
And so I'm going to have the engagement question be led by Monica, and with any fill-in by Dr. Rose as well. But just on the ISE administration in particular, I want to point out that that is for November 2019. It is in the budget. We are actively working now on that implementation, so I would push back just a little bit on miscommunication, but rather that we are just developing how that is going to roll out. We're working closely with schools and with school leaders. Mary Driscoll, who is our associate superintendent for elementary and middle schools, is a key leader of this effort, together with Dr. Rose and Ms. Roberts. And so that work is underway, and we will be addressing a lot of those issues.
When I say miscommunication, not necessarily from you guys, in community, there are some folks who think it literally will be every 6th grader in BPS that will be taking this test and then have the option to opt out.
Right.
Or if it's not every 6th grader, then who are the 6th graders?
And that is actually also my point. So part of that rollout is public communications, distribution of information, clarity of materials. Those are all in development, building toward the November 2019 administration. And with that, let me turn the overall engagement question over to Monica to start.
Thank you.
I think there are a few things that we're going to do. One of the things that we're realizing as we're trying to communicate with families is that your traditional media outlets don't work for all families. And so we've been talking about going back to traditional mailers. There are some challenges with that because we know a lot of our families, there is a high mobility rate, but we also are hearing from families, send it home. A lot of our information goes through our schools, and even as it relates to sharing information to our charter schools and our other colleagues in terms of the parochial and private sectors who also have Boston students. A lot of our families are saying, send it home, send it through partners, YMCA. So we're doing a lot of the partnership model already, but we have not been doing mailers home, so we're going to look at that. We're also going to be looking...
Can you say that again, Monica? I just didn't hear that.
We haven't been sending mailers directly home in terms of informational in advance, so we're going to be looking at that, as well as better, again, leveraging ethnic media. A lot of our families are saying the radio works for us. Right, and so we are going to be looking at how we leverage some of our funding to begin to better leverage our ethnic media, as well as continue to do the high-touch work, such as making phone calls. We have had some cross-departmental efforts in doing that work, and so we want to continue to do that. That is mostly focused on BPS students because those are the students for whom we have to whom we have access and phone numbers. So we hope to do that as well. And we're open to any suggestions that folks have as to how do we continue to further that effort.
Yeah, I mean, our involvement out of my office is a little bit more targeted than Monica's. So we're looking specifically at ESI students, but also low-hanging fruit, really high potential students that we want to push towards taking the ISE exam that historically haven't been taking advantage of it. So that was the push for pre-registration, and now even the push into the schools, because even if you look at our pre-registration numbers, those who are showing up to the test sites on Saturday, I'm looking at the numbers now, there's over 400 highly selective Latinx students that didn't show up for that Saturday exam. So just putting that into schools will increase almost 600 Black and Latinx students who we would say are high potential into putting that exam in front of them versus them having to get to a Saturday program. And so our efforts have been much more targeted towards that kind of low-hanging fruit.
So I'll just add, and maybe this is maybe a little still confused, but two things. So right now, and just a point of clarification, the ISEE, when we roll this out in November of 2019, every sixth grader in BPS, every single sixth grader will be offered a time or slot to take the ISEE and have the option to opt out of that if they choose not to take the test?
So we've currently been talking about pre-registering students.
Yes.
So it will be available to all, but our particular strategy is to pre-register students according to how Dr. Wills has talked about, and so that it is available to all sixth grade students.
Yeah.
During the school day.
During the school day.
In their classroom.
In their classroom. So, I mean, part of this, again, is a balance between making another forced test for students where it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to take that test, and giving people a chance to opt in even if it doesn't look like they might have the grades or whatever to get into an exam school.
Right. There are some sixth graders currently that if they take that test and they did well, if their grades aren't there, they're not going to be able to get into some of these exams.
You're setting them
so
up.
The question is, right, so we're going to be setting them up. So I think the misinformation out in community, in the building around this particular issue is just that. Are we going to have every sixth grader in BPS take the exam and then say, when you get to the exam, if you want to opt out before, great? Or are we going to go through some process where we then take just a subset of our sixth graders and those subset students can then opt out? I think I'm just asking for more clarification on that so that when we go out to community, we don't say all if it really isn't quite all sixth graders.
Right. And again, so this is exactly the right conversation that the work group is working on and finalizing. So that's why I would just want to be clear, and the current conversation and emerging recommendations of the work group around implementation is that it is available to all sixth graders in their buildings, I'm still waiting for a recommendation on whether, for example, right now, it would not necessarily be handed out to every kid sitting in a sixth grade classroom. It might be a different room for those who are taking it over the course of the day. Those logistics are being worked out. The current recommendation is that the work group is recommending a broad identification of high potential students, but not every sixth grader being mandated to take it. And
I
so
think that's important.
that's a broader invitation, and then an additional opt-in for anyone who still wants to take it, even if they don't aren't captured by that wave, and then an opt-out for those who were identified who don't want to take another test. So, you know, again, we always have to have parameters that respect family choice at every step of the process. We welcome input and suggestions. The recommendations are, again, always around unintended consequences, maximizing opportunity, but not obliging students to take a test that is not going to
And I'll just add, this is a step in the
choice.
right direction.
Right.
This is a good thing. It's not just on Saturday, it's in the classroom, but I don't want to go out into community and say all sixth graders if that's not the case. And so right now, we're saying that, and that can create confusion. At a later point, we might have to roll that back and redefine it or define it differently. And I want to be clear that we don't make mistakes.
Right.
So
And
that's what this is.
I
and
think
wanna-
because this is a new initiative, you know, it's the budget still isn't finalized. That's obviously important. It is in this coming year's budget, and we have. So we will be communicating clearly when the work group finishes its work. I think the best conversation at this point is to say that the ISEE will be available at all BPS schools with a sixth grade during the school day, and leave and you know, give the work group just a little more time to finalize its communications materials around those specifics, because that has not yet begun. And obviously, we're using this winter and spring to make sure we've figured out carefully how to implement it. So it's not a misinformation, it's a not yet information in terms of the details of the administration.
Thank you. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Asabi George. I know in the report that you outlined in all three schools, the percentage of Asian students has declined, and some in significant numbers and some not in significant numbers. But could you give us a little bit of background why that would decrease?
I'll take a first shot. It's always difficult to know the reasons why when we see an uptick or a downtick in any particular population, but at the moment, it is a zero-sum game. We have so many seats, a specified number of seats in each exam school, so as we make improvements in correcting some of the current gaps, opportunity gaps for Black and Latinx students, we will expect to see some decrease in white and Asian students who are currently overrepresented compared to their population district-wide.
Yeah, just as an example, at Boston Latin, 2014, I believe there were 24% were Asian, and in 2018, 14%. So it seems like it's a pretty significant number.
25 and 23.
It dropped 3% from 25 to 22%.
Of Latin Academy.
Oh, Latin school.
Academy, yes.
Then the other question I had is, what type of outreach would you be doing for students that are living in public housing? Is there any type of program that you could reach them in the developments, provide some type of educational services to them, whether it's at the Cathedral, high percentage of African Americans, or Lenox, or Villa Victoria, Spanish? But is there any type of outreach we could do to students living in public housing?
I'll just say before, I'm sure Monica Roberts and others may want to speak to that I'm a current BPS 8th grade parent, and I will tell you that my daughter repeatedly says to me, "Is that BPS calling again?" Because she sees me answering the phone so frequently, getting reminder calls that she's eligible for the ISE testing, she's eligible for 9th grade admission, et cetera. So I think that, that with the fact that the district, kudos to Monica's team and our communications department, is using many different forms of communication, not just snail mail, but email, text messaging, phone, robocalling in the language that is the preferred language at home, is not only beneficial in my household, but it's beneficial, I think, to parents who use many different forms of communication across the district. And I don't know if others want to add specifically around public housing.
Yeah, I can. So we have expanded our community engagement team, and in addition to helping us to roll out our public conversations around a series of initiatives. Currently, it's Bill BPS. Part of what we plan to have them doing is also to do a lot of work in the community in terms of attending events and activities overall to raise awareness around initiatives. One of the things that that particular team has done historically is had good relationships with the public housing associations, and so we have historically gone and done information sessions, which we hope to continue to do, and providing incentives for families to come out and to get more information. So we hope to continue to leverage those relationships so that we can encourage families, one, to be aware, and two, to think about whether their child might take the test. I think in terms of the work, in terms of a place-based program, that was something that we will take down as a suggestion in terms of providing supports on site.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Flaherty.
Madam Chair,
Before the buzzer, I really just want to applaud that. Thank you.
can we start me over then?
I haven't even done it yet. There we go.
There you go. Thank you.
Councilor
Madam
Flaherty.
Chair, I was listening. I had a 10 o'clock appointment, so I was not able to make the opening. So I concur with what my colleagues stated, particularly Councilor Wu, I thought, who nailed it, talking about her points and just using this opportunity to talk about all of our public schools, particularly all of our high schools. As folks know, that we had proposed a year 13, just really to address the fact that not enough of our kids are getting into some of the best colleges and universities in the world that call Boston their home, which I think is disgraceful. We want these colleges to take our kids. We want our kids to be able to compete. We don't want our kids, even the brightest of our kids, to be home after the first semester or worse at the Thanksgiving break. So while we boast of graduating and increasing our graduation rates, we really got to set our bar higher, and particularly that we're in a global economy. And we really need to make sure that Boston Public School kids are getting into some of these great institutions, not only getting in, but staying in, being able to compete, get that on their resume, because the jobs that are coming to Boston, and as I referenced yesterday, we've got the bricks and mortar down, we've got the glass and steel down, we've got the loading dock covered, we've got the mailroom covered. We want Boston kids to become the CEOs, the COOs, the CFOs, the general counsels, directors of various divisions within these different companies. And we do that, I think, by having an intense college prep opportunity with the year 13. So that said, I wanted to just go over some of the facts here. If you could just maybe take me through. On page 2, it appears that application trends for Black and Latino students are actually up and steadily increasing. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
Right. And there was also on page 10, there was a statement made, somewhat broad. It said students of color and their families are less likely to be aware of opportunities that exam schools offer, as well as application enrollment process. What is that based on? Based on two factors. One, page 2, which says that it's trending up. And then the other slide, which goes right to, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, which is 40% of the students didn't bother to show up for the test. We want to push it on to transportation. We want to push it on to geography. Is there any parental responsibility? Does the Boston Public Schools ever call out parents for sort of, that's, and my children went to the Boston Public Schools. More mail came to my house. We could have had a forest with the stuff that came home in the mail. So it's not about notice, but we always tend to deflect that. Your primary responsibility is the education of your children. It's the greatest equalizer. But we give, and I understand, we get grandparents raising grandchildren. We have fractured homes. We have dysfunctional, I get all that. But for 40% of the kids to just not show up, some of that onus is on the parents. 5th and 6th grade, my mother did it. I was blessed. My mother went through my book bag and got all the papers, just like you're doing with your kids. She signed me up. She filled everything out. She made sure we were out of bed and at the test site. where are the parents in this discussion? And why does BPS let them off the hook? Year in and year out, we continue to put all the resources to the issue, but in those instances when kids are just not showing up, and our parents aren't stepping up to the plate, scratching and clawing for the best opportunity for their child, I just think that needs to be addressed. And again, it's broad, I get that, and it's a multilingual issue, and we get grandparents raising grandchildren, and we got lots of issues, but I tend to think that some parents are just not stepping up to the plate. Time for some of the parents to get in the game, you know, and not be out to lunch, but be invested in their children's education. So I'd love to hear from you, Superintendent.
Thank you, Counselor. I think it's important that BPS's strategies are around both and. We are both reaching out to families, and I think what Monica has just described are the phone calls home, are the reminders. We do want to leverage all of the assets available to broaden opportunities for our students, which includes involving their families in the conversation, but also involving programming opportunities where adults from the schools can interact directly with them and the relationships that develop. So it is a both and. We are reaching out directly to families, and we do believe it is BPS's responsibility to make more opportunities available to all of our students, regardless of what their personal experience brings to the table by way of their family environment. So we believe it's our responsibility to do both. And in terms of seeing the significant increase in applications among both Black and Latinx students, I would say that that is directly related to the robust additional efforts that, as I pointed out in our testimony, began or reinvigorated in 2016 through the Exam School Initiative. So the pre-registration, the stronger programs. And so I think we need to continue to examine the no-show rates, but I would point out that those come in the wake of a broader pre-registration and enrollment effort. So it is possible that there's still work to do in making sure that it is easy for those families and those students who may have less help at home to get themselves to the Saturday exam to now have the opportunity to take it in their school building. We view these as moving together.
Right. And do we know how many currently how many Boston students attend METCO?
I'm afraid I don't have that data off the top of my head.
And I would like that information only for the simple reason is that right now folks go from birth and delivery and sign up right for METCO, number one. Two, it would be great if we can attract some of those METCO students back into the system who are currently in, say, the Wellesleys and the Westwoods and the Wayland public school system, which are great school systems, because of the they're the pride of our fleet, the 3 exam schools along with our Arts Academy. They're for gifted students. It's the 3-4 hours of homework a night, and to have kids that are in a sort of a rigorous and strict curriculum be able to come back into our system, I think that would be a good first start for us to try to attract those children, those families back to the Boston Public School system that are currently in a METCO school. And then finally, and you guys have touched on it, if you know, and teachers know, and principals know, when you have a gifted 5th or 6th grade student that may have a grandparent raising them or may come from some chaos, or there may be some problems at home, and that kid's just kind of floundering around. It's the onus of the teacher and the principal to help that kid apply to these schools. That's going to be the greatest equalizer for that kid that's sort of in that type of broken home environment, and or, again, through no fault of his or her own, they're in a situation, but they're a gifted student, and you guys know the gifted students. The teachers know the gifted students. And for those teachers to be able to hopefully step up, working with the administration, getting those applications, and also making sure that the kid gets to the test site, I think is critical. And I'm sure that they're doing it now. It would be nice to see if they could do it even more. So I know I've exhausted my 5 minutes, but I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. Councilor Zakam. Thank you, Councilor Zakam. I do want to note that we're also joined by former Councilor Scapicchio here in the audience. Thank you for visiting with us. I have a quick follow-up question on some of the outreach efforts done by the exam schools. One, I fully appreciate, let me just set my timer. I fully appreciate the effort that all of you have taken, but Headmaster Scarrett mentioned the 5th graders from the Russell School as a whole I'm going to, as a whole getting in here, as a whole getting into Latin school and visiting, I'd love to see that extend across the schools, especially during the school day. It would require some support from transportation, a budget that I like to see contracted, not expanded, but I think that's great effort. If you could just expound upon that a little bit and share that with us.
Yes, I think you touched on it, Counselor, that I guess there are two challenges. One is, and I have to admit, we were a little unsure how to host a large group of fifth graders during the school day. It was a new ask for us, and we were happy to be asked. This was in response to outreach that we did to principals, inviting them to take advantage of our tours. Principal of the Russell School happened to be able to get the transportation himself and asked if they can do a fuller visit. And I think once we did it and we now have a structure for it, we realized that it can be replicated. But I think you hit the nail on the head with the transportation challenges. Is that, getting the bus, also school start times and lunch times, et cetera, sometimes impede. We get started early as high schools, and even with Russell, they were delayed just, with a much later start time. And then waiting for students to arrive and getting over. Some of those logistics can sometimes be inhibitive, but I also think that we have as effective means sometimes trying to get our own students over to elementary schools, as they're our best ambassadors and can speak authentically to the experience. And I think that's something that might be more easily replicated, especially with elementary schools that might have later dismissal times or after school programs. We can send students right at dismissal from our schools over to those schools and engage that way as well.
Great, thank you. I'd love to see that expanded. The ranking data was also referenced here. Do we have any of the ranking data? So I understand just from my own parent circles, I've got 2 at Latin School and 2 at Latin Academy, that there is this sort of shift in how we're ranking schools for our kids, but can we share that at all? Do we know what that is?
You have that data, and I'm sure we can get it too.
Great, thank you for that. And then on slide 14, that just references the registration, how many took the test and how many didn't show. Have we done because there is a makeup day for no show on the test. Is there an opportunity to just very aggressively follow up with families whose student doesn't show for makeup day to get them in the door?
Yeah, that's possible. So if any student that misses the first day, absolutely a BPS student can come to the makeup day, as well as any student who's verified registration who is not a BPS student. So we can do some additional work around that.
Yeah, some people on my team actually did that this year.
Right.
Pushed to get the data around who was showing up to the first seating in real time, and then made some outreach calls specifically to students to try to get them to come to the makeup.
And then what's the percentage of families taking the test privately? With my boys, we did, just to do a dry run, I just through talking with my own network of parents, did a dry run, paid for the test privately, and then my kids took it at Latin School on the exam day. The difference in how the day went there was a huge contrast. I sat with Maria after my older boy took the test, and just the differences were stark. And to know that for each application of the ISEE, the city of Boston actually pays more than I paid to take it privately and get my results within a few weeks was really disappointing. That difference, I think, is very stark and a problem. How many of our families are taking the test privately?
That's data I will have to come back with.
Is it a significant amount?
I don't want to guess, so
Okay.
I'd rather give you correct information.
Okay, please. I would appreciate that, because I think that it was really great. And then last, for me, is the BPS residency conversation. I know we ended our presentation on some of that data. Do we have, I don't know, Carolyn, I know you're here. I don't know if you can sort of expound on that. Was it 107, Monica, that you said, and 29 kids were discharged?
Yes.
How many kids are discharged from the exam schools generally over the course of the school year? If 30% are not living in the city of Boston and falsely. Is there anything else, though, to share on the number of kids taking the test, how many kids we're discharging over the course of check confirming residency?
So the flag list is the list that includes all charter, private, parochial, students who are homeschooled and out-of-district public. So we vet that entire list. So those are students that have taken the exam that we have concerns about.
So at this rate, I'm going to say it one more time and then I'm done. 107 kids were flagged. 29 of them have been discharged since taking the test this past November. So it's
Correct.
almost 30% of
Yes.
students falsifying residency data for the purpose of attending one of our fine 3 exam schools.
And I just,
30% of those flagged,
Of
though.
those flagged.
Yeah, I just,
no,
yeah.
those flagged.
I just want to make sure
Yeah,
that
that's
the
fine.
data doesn't get interpreted as 30% have residency issues. That
Well,
was, of those already
I do
flagged.
wonder what the real number is of residency issues within our Boston Public Schools.
So I just want to be clear. The 30% is of those already flagged.
Thank you. I can sense tomorrow's headline. I appreciate that. Thank you. Counselor Janey.
Thank you so much. And I will just try to be brief. I know we're on a timer here. Try to get it under the buzzer if I can. Just to follow up on some of the questions from earlier. One idea that has been floated out there was giving students who kind of matriculate through BPS some sort of preference. And I just want to understand what the data says. So how many students that are entering into our exams are coming K through 5, or K through 6, excuse me, from one of the BPS schools versus other schools? Do you have that information?
Do you mean from kindergarten or were previously in 5th grade?
No, from kindergarten. I said K through 5.
Okay. I don't have that. I know it's about over 60% of students that matriculate in exam schools
Have
are
come from a
from
5th
BPS. Yeah, so I don't.
What's that percentage again?
I'm not going to give you an specific one, but it's over 6. It's about 60%.
About
60-40.
So just to say, about 60% of the students in exam schools, one of the 3 exam schools, have come from a Boston
BPS.
Public School.
Yeah.
I'm also very interested in the choices that families are making, and that maybe that'll come out in your data requests, Madam Chair. But I spoke with someone this morning who made an interesting choice, whose child tested, and again, this is, I guess, getting to the ranking and how we perceive schools, but tested into BLS, but chose BLA as their first choice. Another parent that I know tested for BLA but chose O'Brien as their first choice. So I'm really interested in understanding what choices families are making, and then really trying to understand why that is. And maybe we won't know, but I tend to believe that families want the best for their kids, and that they want the best for their kids regardless of their income, regardless of what neighborhoods they live in. And they're making choices, whether it's to enter into BPS, whether it's to take an exam, whether it's to go to a charter or to a METCO system, or wherever they're going. Families are making choices, and I think the more we understand why families are making the choices that they're making, the better we will be in terms of providing the education that they are seeking. So I'm very interested in understanding that. Let's see, I'm trying to get it under the buzzer because I really want to hear from the second panel, and I want to hear from those who have come to testify. In terms of the grading, I want to come back to the grading work group. That conversation is happening this fall, just so that I'm clear? Or it's ongoing?
It's actually happening right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tom.
And so the conversation's happening now. When do we expect some sort of rollout so that the grading system in Boston Public Schools will better match what other schools are doing?
So there's already been a soft rollout around memos to school leaders and 5th grade teachers around the grading policy 1 to 4 and trying to norm. Now, I think norming across the board in general is something that you constantly have to work at
Exactly,
and
because,
calibrate. Yeah.
right, it's very difficult in my experience to change the culture of such a large institution like Boston Public Schools. Are you working with the teachers union on that?
I think we have a presentation coming up this week or next week right around this topic with BTU during, I think, before negotiations. I'll say the culture is part of the reason why we didn't switch to A through F, because the majority of the teachers were already operationalizing 4 as anything in the A range. And so that's part of it. So the lift hopefully isn't huge, but it's making sure that we get to every pocket in every school and every 5th grade teacher to understand that.
Wonderful. And I guess I will just end here, just the importance of access and opportunity really being central to these discussions, making sure that we're doing all we can so that there is, in fact, equity. You noted that there are, I think you each noted that there are certain groups that are overrepresented and certain groups that are underrepresented. And the larger issue, which my colleagues have made a point to raise here, which I think is absolutely right, is that all of our students in Boston Public Schools should have the opportunity to receive the world-class education that they get in our exam schools, regardless of which choice that they make. So if they're choosing an open enrollment school, if they're choosing one of the selective admission schools, regardless of where they choose, they should get a very high-quality education that prepares them for future success. And so I do applaud the work that you're doing. I'm glad that this conversation is continuing. From my days at Mass Advocates for Children, thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with each of you. And thank you to our headmasters who have joined us this morning. I'm very grateful for your participation and your leadership in our schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor George.
Do good.
Thank you, Bora. Just picking up on a few sort of the low-hanging fruit, and all of this is good stuff because it's moving forward. So just to follow up, the working group that is specifically working on this expansion of the ISEE so that it's available in the classroom, more accessible to parents, of course, more accessible to 6th graders who probably wouldn't learn about it, the pre-registration, incredible. What's the timeline with respect to when us and the public, the council, would hear back as to what the final recommendations are about that rollout?
I think we're hoping definitely by the end of the school year in June. I think there's some outstanding things around contracts, and so I don't want to promise a date, but we're actively we're actively meeting every week. So, yeah.
And then the pre-registration itself, that process of looking at a more robust criteria, could we get that in writing, like what that pre-registration criteria is, how it works? Like, is it just pre-registering the 6th graders, or are we also going to think about using this pre-registration process to get to 5th graders? This is the first time I've heard about the pre-registration. I think it's fantastic. Just wanting to know a little bit more about the criteria. How is it going to work in identifying the 6th graders to pre-register them? And is there any consideration around expanding this to other grade levels, like 5th grade?
Yeah, we can certainly get you the historical, so like the last 2 years. I think that's one of the conversations the working group is engaged in now around, like, what are the criteria going to be for next year, especially as we move into schools.
And is it just 6th graders for now, this pre-registration process?
Yes, it's
Okay.
for 6th grade, the 7th grade test, or 6th grade test, sorry.
And you can include numbers of the actual students that you pre-register and all of that?
That were previously pre-registered.
Yep.
We can try to project, but we don't know until we actually do it.
Okay.
Yep.
And because I think there's so much misinformation or misleading information out there in the community. What I mean by that is folks who actually think that if their student takes the ISEE, just the exam, that they have, and do really well, that they have a shot in getting into an exam school. And there's more layers to this process. So it's not only important that families know the process and the information, but also that it may not be an excellent idea for their student to take that exam to expose that student to a new test if we know beforehand that they're not actually going to be able to qualify for one of our exam schools, which I think would be setting up the student and the family to fail. So look forward to staying in conversation on that. Just a couple of questions around test prep. Is the test prep still being funded sort of by Latin School Association, the mayor? At what point do we think about rolling that into the budget of BPS to fund this important and essential program for our students?
Yeah, I think the majority of the budget is BPS budget. Yeah, I think it's about a little over 30,000 from BLSA and a contribution from the mayor, but the program in and of itself is almost $200,000 when you're looking at the summer and the Mondays going up. So majority is BPS.
But at some point,
And we can get you that budget breakdown. I just want to underscore that BPS is carrying the bulk of that cost. And so we always appreciate, being augmented by private sources, but the bulk of the money is being paid by BPS. I also want to point out that that is also true for Excellence for All, which is a significant budgetary commitment that BPS has undertaken, maintained, and expanded over the past 3 years. Again, also sustained in our budget proposal for FY20 as well.
This came up in previous conversations, so only bring it up because test prep we know is essential, particularly for students of color. And I think it's at some point, while it's great that the mayor and, of course, the Latin School Association are funding pieces of this, what would it mean to bring it internally to say that this is ours completely, 100%? So I just put that out there because that came up in previous conversations. The last point is on the grading, applaud your work on the grading. That also came up in previous conversations, and so thank you, Dr. Rose, for the work you're doing, the working group, around some folks feeling like the process was unfair with respect to private schools. But one piece, is your conversation going or involving any students that are homeschooled? Obviously, homeschool students are creating, I imagine, their own grades. I don't know how that works. Do we have a number or percentage of the students who are homeschooled that are actually applying to our exam schools and getting in? And so does the grading conversation include our homeschool students, and what does that look like?
It does include students who are homeschooled. I will work on getting you a number in terms of exactly how many. And to the earlier question of how many are taking the test overall, for this last school year, there were 3,400 and 327 took it privately, but I'll work on getting the homeschool
Wait, say
number.
that again, Monica, I'm sorry.
Just on the earlier question of how many are taking the test overall, there are 3,400 and 327 are taking it privately, and I'll work on seeing, get the number for homeschools.
Right, and the different. Okay.
Thank you.
So it's a small number, smaller. Lastly, I'll say, I know we have another panel, and so this conversation continues, or two more, is obviously some of this is short-term, and you guys are working hard at it, and my line of question is not designed to offend, frankly. It's to work in partnership and to ask the tough questions on behalf of my constituents, right? And then there's also the long-term conversations around some of these ideas that came from the advocates, which they'll speak to, that I know you can't flip a switch and it will not happen overnight. It really does need to be robust and thoughtful, and also probably involve even more stakeholders than we could even imagine. But look forward to at least continuing the conversation around some of the long-term plans and having some sense of timeline as to when the district may make a decision as to whether they are going to proceed with a recommendation or not. Would love to hear more at some point as to what that could look like. It might be by the end of the year that you say, of these 4 recommendations, the first one we really don't think is great, and this is why, based on all the conversations we've had. So look forward to joining in more conversations with respect to the long-term proposed ideas and solutions. Thank you, guys, and thank you so much to the headmasters for being here.
So we're going to end this panel. I do really thank your time here. I hope that you'll stay if you can. I know the headmasters want to get back to school, which I'm happy. Tell my children I say hello. And we are going to switch gears to our second panel. In the meantime, I'd like to invite another member of the public, Christine, Langhoff, if you'd like to come and give public testimony during this switch, that would be great to speed us along. For panel number 2, I have Joshua Goodman, who is from the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as Melanie Rosinski from Harvard Kennedy as well. So you want to add panel number 3 with panel number 2? Okay. So I'm going to also invite Edith Bazil, who's the president of Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts, Willie Broderick, Reverend Broderick, who is chair of the Black Network for Black Student Achievement, Jose Lopez, who's not here, is Rahan, I don't see Rahan here, okay. And then Lauren Sampson, who is a fellow for the Lawyers for Civil Rights. So we'll have our panel across the beginning. As they get settled, Christine, I'll give you the go in a few seconds just so we can all pay attention, but thank you for being ready to go. And I just want to note, we do have a hearing scheduled immediately following this hearing. That's less a message to the panelists and more one to my colleagues. Thank you. So I see that Christine has stepped out for a moment, so I'm going to invite, because I wanted to get one person in. Megan Camello, if you'd like to come up and give your testimony while we're transitioning over. Thank you, Megan.
Hi, my name is Megan Camello, and I currently work in Lisa's office, but I'm here today wearing a different hat. I'm a fourth-year student at Northeastern.
Say it one more time, because the mic didn't pick you up. We want to make sure, full disclosure.
So I currently work in Anissa's office, but I'm wearing a different hat today. I'm a fourth-year student at Northeastern University, and I'm the Director of Policy for Northeastern's chapter of the Roosevelt Institute. And for the past 6 months, I've been working on a policy proposal related to the exam schools, and in the coming months, it's going to be published in Roosevelt's 10 Ideas Journal. I have a few things I wanted to highlight today. First, I think it's important to remember Boston's role in public education. In 1635, Boston Latin School became the first ever public school in the United States, and Boston was the birthplace of public education. However, today the city's 3 public exam schools challenge the very notion of public education by creating a hierarchical system of school quality within the district. Second, I want to talk about the Rappaport Institute report that was released last fall. The report clarified kind of what we already knew. The demographics of the 3 exam schools are not a reflection of the district. The clear demographic divide in enrollment pattern is due to leftover remnants of the structural and institutional hiccups of the notorious busing and desegregation movement of BPS. The lingering inequities continue to systematically disadvantage low-income and students of color. The report highlighted the problem with the ISEE and used linear analysis to show how using the MCAS will increase diversity in the exam schools. I think this is a good short-term solution. However, it further emphasizes the importance of an exam rather than a holistic model to support students, which is what our colleges have been aiming to move away from. I think BPS should consider looking at what New York City did to try and increase diversity at their exam schools. They currently have 8 exam schools. This past summer, they committed to expanding their Discovery program, which is a summer program that places a limited number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds at the city's 8 specialized high schools that give the exam. By 2020, they committed that 20% of the 9th grade seats in all of the 8 public exam high schools will be set aside for those students that participate in the Discovery program, and currently it's only 5%. So this solution will bypass the state legislature, which has to approve the changes about switching the exam. Addressing the structural issues that continue to plague Boston's exam schools is a critical step to improving Boston's reputation in public education. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Christine, thank you. You had stepped out, so I had Megan cut you in line.
Hi, my name is Christine Langhoff. I'm a Dorchester resident, BPS graduate, a retired BPS teacher. My 3 kids are BPS graduates as well. During the last 13 years of my 36-year career, I was a teacher at the O'Brien, and during that time, for 10 years, my own kids attended Boston Latin schools, so this gives me a perspective on exam schools that a lot of people don't have. Let me say that I believe there's a place for exam schools within our system. Students with strong academic abilities have as much right to a curriculum that is appropriate for them as do any of our other students. Although the exam schools are often referred to as elite, about 25% of our high schoolers attend one. As Councilor Wu mentioned, we could discuss whether that percentage might be better if it were higher or lower, but right now it's based on how many seats we have in those school buildings. There are 3 things that pertain to the exam schools I'd like to address this morning: testing, advanced work classes, and equity among the exam schools. I'm glad to hear about the outreach efforts by the exam schools and by the school department to diversify the applicant pool for the exam schools. However, I believe the tests themselves are quite problematic and that tweaks around awareness and availability of tests and test prep are insufficient. If a case could be made for standardized tests masquerading as merit, exam school admission is it. There's a perfect correlation among socioeconomic status and race across the 3 student bodies at the 3 different exam schools. With BLS as the whitest and the wealthiest, BLA in the middle, and O'Brien with the lowest income and 90% minority students, 55% of whom speak a language other than English at home. This is exactly what research on standardized testing predicts. I don't think we want to posit that the ISEE is a reflection of a meritocracy. I believe talent and ability is distributed equally across races and native languages, and that sorting mechanisms like the ISEE reinforce stereotypical patterns which continue to cripple our city and poison the dialogue about our schools. After all, if kids can be coached to a higher score, then what's being measured is how well you can take a test, not your innate intelligence. When my twins took the exam, just to give an example, one had between 3 and 5 more wrong answers than the other. This resulted in a difference of 357 spots in ranking. There's no way that one exam can give you that level of granular detail. Essentially, when you look at an exam like this, every student above a cutoff point is equally qualified. I would propose that we eliminate the ISEE as a criteria for admission. Specifically, the ISEE has not been chosen because of its validity or its reliability, nor has it been shown to be of high caliber. In fact, according to WGBH's reporting on October 23rd, the opposite is true. Quoting, "The admissions test for Boston Latin and the city's other 2 exam schools has not been shown to accurately predict how students of color are likely to do in high school, according to this test maker's own study." According to a follow-up on November 2nd, Educational Records Bureau's ISEE test has been chosen simply because no other testing organization has bid for the contract since 2012. But Superintendent Chang, McDonough, and Carol Johnson all deem the test maker's bids appropriate. So we're using a test which has no demonstrated validity for students of color, a demographic which represents 80% of our student body, in order to decide which of them may attend an exam school. In addition, about half of Boston students have English as their second language, which disadvantages them a second time. Just as the ISEE isn't valid for exam school admission, the Terra Nova isn't valid for AWC admission. It follows in that there's no point in retesting students to allow them to continue in AWC either. There are no standardized tests which have been shown to be valid and or reliable for such young children. Under the field Race to the Top and now the newer ESSA regulations, such testing has raised hackles among specialists in early childhood education for just this reason. David Berliner in the Washington Post in 2011 wrote that these tests are completely useless as predictors of the scores children received on the same measures a few years later. The research quite convincingly shows that for young children, even over relatively short time periods, predictions from one administration of a test to the next are not usually accurate enough to engender any confidence that this year's performance will tell us much about next year's performance. Berliner also found that teachers' insights about their students were as reliable as testing, at far less expense and investment of time. He found that, quote, "Many teachers exhibited correlations greater than 0.90, indicating that teachers are quite capable of providing the state with information about who needs help and who does not in about 10 minutes, and at the saving of millions of dollars," close quote. The reason I raise AWC is that those are the classes which prepare our students for the exam school strand. If we do not correctly identify all the students who should receive AWC classes, we cannot help to prepare them for exam schools. This is something that's concerned me for more than 20 years. I did some research which I submitted to Dr. Yulan Lin, who at the time was in charge of the advanced work class, and the same inequities are replicated today. There was a report 15 years ago, there was a report in 2015 from Associate Superintendent Mary Driscoll and Carla Estrada, which found that only 9% of Boston Public School students were enrolled in AWC. The racial discrepancies continue. 813 seventh grade students at exam schools. of which 464 came from BPS schools. 57% of those students came into exam schools from parochial or private schools. As we saw this morning, not much has changed. We do have better information for parents in second languages, which is the Exam School Initiative. I wasn't able to find data by race for students in AWC in one place on the website, but we still have a continued alliance on a single October test. I could count only 10 grade 6 AWC programs, which include a hybrid model on the BPS website. That would give about 7% of our sixth graders at 25 students per class. It's about 250 kids who've had the preparation for the 850 exam school seats we have in 7th grade. One of the things that was given on the slide today was the number of students who were enrolled in AWC versus the number of students enrolled in the Excellence for All classes. I do not believe that Excellence in All is sufficient. It shortchanges students who need more challenging academics. And currently, Black and Latinx students, which are about 80% of our population, represent only 25% of the students in AWC classes, but 78% of those have Excellence for All. In other words, it's just another example of the same disparities. Councilor Campbell mentioned a need to rebrand our exam schools. There's no reason the exam schools and their students need to be sorted and ranked as they are. It's a choice to do so. Why is there such disparity among the resources and prestige of the exam schools? How does it serve the children of our school when only one school is treated as the best and most BPS kids can't attend it? It's the inherent biases in the tests which cause this skewing. It would not be such a pressing matter if the resources of funding, prestige, social capital, and respect were equally distributed among the 3 schools. They are not. Our kids know this, and the adults need to act. There was a college fair held at school, after school at BLS, which was open to all students, so I encouraged a group of my O'Brien kids to go. When I debriefed them the next day, one of the girls commented, "Those kids must be so much smarter than us." I asked why she would think that, and she replied, "Well, their building is so much nicer than ours. They must deserve it because they're better than us." I still get just enraged when I think about the silent message that she absorbed. So my recommendations would be to eliminate the Terra Nova for AWC. Use teacher recommendations and GPA instead to identify students. I would propose that we eliminate the ISEE, but I'm a realist, so I don't think that's a viable solution. At least, let's find a new test vendor, one who can give us a reliable test that is valid for our population. Change the weight of the tests of admission to the exam school by adding teacher recommendations. Trust those who know the kids best. It's not a new idea. Back in the day, admittance to BLS used to be based on them. Colleges find GPAs and teacher recommendations give strong information about candidates. More than 1,000 colleges are now test optional, including many prestigious ones, such as the University of Chicago. Let's move to a more holistic view of our students. Differences among scores are not going to yield a good differentiation among the group of kids who sit for the exam. So everyone above a certain cutoff point is equally qualified. On that basis, let all students who attain a given profile on the ISEE, GPA, and teacher recommendations be admitted to an exam school pool. Then by lottery, students can be randomly and equally distributed across the 3 schools according to income, neighborhoods, gender, non-English native speakers, and race, such that all 3 schools have identical demographics. I believe this is a huge change, but I think it's worth it for our students. A lot of the policy we have built one after another in ways that have not resolved this problem. It's time to take a more serious look. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you to our panel for joining us this afternoon. I will start with Professor Goodman, and we'll work our way off. Just that's how the list was given to me for our panel. So welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the City Council for inviting us to this hearing. My name is Josh Goodman. I'm an Associate Professor of Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Before I did my PhD in economics and became an academic, I was a public high school math teacher in Watertown, Massachusetts. I'm here with Melanie Rosinski, a doctoral student with whom I wrote the policy brief that I'd like to discuss now. Ms. Rosinski and I were connected to the Boston Public Schools by the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, which had identified the need for data-driven analysis of the Boston exam school's diversity challenges. BPS generously agreed to share data with us on its students in order to help us identify where in the pathway to the exam schools Black and Hispanic students were being lost. In other words, could we pinpoint more precisely why the exam schools do not have the same racial composition as the district as a whole? Before describing the results of this study, I want to directly address the fact that many people assume that efforts to improve exam school diversity must imply lowering the academic standards that determine admission into those schools. We are here in part to argue that this is not the case. We believe the exam schools can improve the diversity of their student bodies without changing their nature as academically selective institutions. In particular, our data show that there are a substantial number of high-achieving Black and Hispanic BPS students who do not currently receive invitations to exam schools, but would under a simple shift in the admissions process. We define high achievers, for our purposes, as those BPS students whose 5th grade MCAS scores place them in the top 25% of the district, which is the pool of students the exam schools largely draw their student bodies from now. Even among students measured as high achieving by that standardized test, there are large racial gaps in various stages of the exam school admissions process. Let me list 3 specific ones. First, ISEE taking. Among BPS's high achievers, Black and Hispanic students are about 20 percentage points less likely to take the ISEE than white and Asian students with similar MCAS scores, similarly high MCAS scores. This means that differences in academic achievement cannot fully explain racial gaps in ISEE taking rates. It also means that there are substantial numbers of high-achieving Black and Hispanic students who fail to take the ISEE exam even though they would likely do well on it. Second gap is ISEE scores. Among BPS's high achievers, Black and Hispanic ISEE takers score 12 percentiles lower on the ISEE than their white and Asian counterparts, even when comparing students with similar MCAS scores to begin with. This discrepancy may be driven by the fact that the curriculum covered on the ISEE exam is substantially different from that covered on the MCAS and in BPS more generally. Many students, as we know, receive out-of-school tutoring to help prepare for ISEE, tutoring which anecdotal evidence suggests Black and Hispanic students are receiving less of. The third gap I want to touch on is exam school preferences. Again, even among BPS's high achievers, Black and Hispanic students are about 13 percentage points less likely than white and Asian students to rank BLS as their first choice. That BLS is less attractive to the highest achieving Black and Hispanic students contributes to the disparities in its enrollment rates. So substantial racial gaps exist in ISEE taking rates, ISEE scores, and listing BLS as a first choice. More importantly, underlying differences in academic strength cannot fully explain these facts, as racial gaps exist in each of these dimensions, even among the academically strongest BPS students, as measured by MCAS. How do these differences affect which students receive exam school invitations? The total effect of these various gaps is that among BPS's high achievers, Black and Hispanic students are 26 percentage points less likely to be invited to any exam school than their white and Asian peers of similar academic strength. They are also 26 percentage points less likely to be invited to BLS specifically. In short, the current admissions process results in substantial numbers of talented, underrepresented minority students being overlooked. Could BPS change its admissions criteria to exam schools in a way that keeps academic selectivity high and improves diversity? We think so. We show that using 5th grade MCAS scores to invite students to the exam schools could shift Black and Hispanic representation in BLS from roughly 20% to 30% of the student body. The MCAS provides a universal, arguably objective measure of academic skill that is comparable across all schools and aligned with the curriculum that BPS schools arguably should be teaching. The ISEE, in contrast, is an optional exam that requires substantial investment from parents and students of time, effort, and money in order to succeed. As such, it is not clear that sorting students by ISEE scores is a better way to identify those who have learned best from Boston schools and will likely thrive at the exam schools. Our data suggests that incorporating MCAS scores into the admissions process has the potential to improve diversity. We believe this could be accomplished while maintaining the high academic requirements of the current admissions process, given that invitations would still be determined by a standardized measure of academic achievement. Ultimately, there appears to be little tension between substantially improving diversity and maintaining these schools' rigorous academic standards. Further details of our analysis can be found in our full policy brief on the Rappaport Institute's website. We're grateful for the opportunity to share this analysis. This is important work, and we are glad to contribute to this conversation. We are also happy to answer questions, but I have to say that both Melanie and I have prior obligations that require us to leave very shortly. So if we're going to answer questions, it will probably have to be now because we both have classes.
I appreciate that. I will ask the sponsors if they have any specific questions for the two of you. Councilor Janey?
No, we met, so go ahead. You're reading things.
All right. Well, we really, yeah.
And did you submit that testimony that you just read from?
I have not, but I'm happy to do that.
If you would leave it with us, that would be great, because we can share it with our colleagues.
Absolutely. Should I email it? Well, I can leave you the text, which is now scrawled upon, but should I email it to you as well? Here, I'll give you the text, but I'll email it to you as well. We really appreciate the opportunity to come, and we're happy to answer questions at either now or at some later time, but we apologize that we have some prior commitments.
No, that's fine. We did go well over time that we thought we would.
All right.
Thank you to both of you for being here.
Thank you both very much.
And please exit stage right. As we get to the rest of our panel, I don't particularly care what the order is.
Okay.
So we'll start with you, Reverend Broderick, because you're closest.
Good morning to Councilor Sabi George, our Education Chair, to Madam President, Councilor Campbell, to my City Councilor Kim Janey, and to all the City Councilors who were previously here, and to all those who are present today, to our Superintendent who's still here in attendance, Superintendent Perrell, and to her executive staff as well. My name is Reverend Willie Broderick II. I serve as the Associate Pastor of the historic 12th Baptist Church, and I serve as the chairperson for the Boston Network for Black Student Achievement. I also gladly serve as a member of the Boston Public Schools Opportunity and Achievement Gap Task Force, and more importantly, I'm a proud Roxbury resident. 1 month ago, during Black History Month, many of us gathered into the hallowed halls and sanctuary of the First African Meeting House, where our Mayor, Mayor Martin J. Walsh, signed an executive order to promote racial equity and leadership in the city of Boston. This order states and acknowledges, and I quote, that racial and economic and social inequities persist across many areas, including education, and that the city of Boston acknowledges the role that institutional and structural racism have had and continue to have to contribute to the individual and collective trauma of communities of color. On today, I come to this body with a broad perspective and to really make real on this executive order and to cash the check that was written to us by this city. I was deeply disturbed today to hear one of the councilors of this body suggest that the parents of those who did not come to attest or did not sign up were not doing their job and were not handling their responsibilities. Before I continue my statement, I have to address that because it couldn't sit on my spirit right without saying something. The parents in our communities are strong, they're resilient, they care, they love, they work hard, sometimes 2 jobs, sometimes through language barriers, and many a times, just like every parent, they want what's best for their kids. And I was troubled that there was no pushback from this body to say to Councilor Flaherty that that was problematic, and that those ideas are some of the reasons why some of our children and our parents don't want to go to certain schools. We need to encourage each and every child and make sure we give the wraparound support, because we know, as I know, that the issues in this city are intersectional, and they should not be reduced to the care of a parent to one test. And so I'll continue with my statement, but I had to get that off my chest, because I know that the city and the people of this city are working hard each and every day, and that our parents are rock stars, and they truly are. The city of Boston is approximately 53% people of color. Boston Public School comprises of 75% black and brown children and 85% children of color. Yet when it comes to our 3 exam schools, as has been mentioned already, we are underrepresented. Only 40% are enrolled at the 3 exam schools in totality, but only 20% are enrolled in the historic Boston Latin School. This is evidence of racial inequity, and this is a particular evidence of the fact that we need to change the narrative in Boston. And really the question that I want to ask today is, do we want to be a city that is only equitable rhetorically, or do we want to be a city that's equitable in reality? I do applaud the efforts of Boston Public Schools in their attempts to create more access by administering the ISEE during school coming this fall or this winter, and also applaud the efforts of the Exam School Initiative. But I believe that it will take more than just convenience to create a substantial impact on the racial equity gaps that are here in this city. So today I don't come with just critiques, I come with suggestions to address this problem. First, I would suggest that we eliminate the exam altogether. It has been proven that school success and academic success is a great indicator of what a young person will do in their future. Elite academic institutions like the University of Chicago has eliminated the SAT and ACT requirement altogether because they've come to the conclusion that one's academic record is a better indicator than a standardized test score or academic indicator of where they stand intellectually. Number two, I suggest that if we have to keep the exam, BPS must expand the scope of admissions to consider factors beyond the ISEE. Students are greater than test scores and should be considered holistically and not numerically. If we are going to administer the ISEE, BPS should ensure that the public school curriculum comprehensively prepares each and every student for the test. There are students who have been educated their whole academic careers in BPS, but they must take an exam at their own risk because the curriculum that they have been given disadvantages them on this test. And usually only the students who are able to get those extra resources, those who are able to get the private testing, and those who are able to get the support that they need have a fighting chance to do well on this exam. I implore BPS to get our children the requisite learning exposure they need rather than punish them because of pedagogical decisions that are outside of their control. And last, when our children do get to these exam schools, the city should ensure that they are supported and that they are not walking into hostile academic environments. I implore the city to ensure that there is cultural proficiency and cultural competence on the part of all educators and those who work with our young people. To address this issue, BPS should continue to push forward the work of the implementation of culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. And as I close on this day, I want to make sure that we do not narrow this conversation. Narrow it so much so that we unintentionally message to young people that if they do not attend these schools, that their education is subpar. I'm reminded of a young lady who I worked with in the NAACP, and she transferred from Boston Latin School to another BPS school. And what she tragically told me was that everyone told her she had just lost out on a great opportunity in life and that her chances of success were greatly diminished. That shouldn't be the message we are giving our young people. That shouldn't be what we are telling them. And I hope to work with each and every one of you to ensure that we are raising the standard of all of our schools, but ensuring that we are giving that same pride that we give to these exam schools to each and every school in Boston Public School. I close on this as a proud public school product who went on to Georgetown University, Harvard Divinity School, and now to Northeastern University School of Law. I ask that we come together and let's move the ball along to ensure that equity is there for all of our students. So I thank you all for your time. I thank you for your leadership to bring this conversation forward. And I look forward to working with each of you to change the narrative in the city of Boston, to close opportunity and achievement gaps, and to make sure that we are creating a more equitable city for all of our children and families. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam President, and Councilor Janey. We really appreciate you holding this hearing, and we acknowledge the steps that have been taken in an effort to move Boston Public Schools in the direction of providing educational excellence for all students, regardless of race, gender, language, economic status, disability, or income. I also want to note that the piloted Excellence for All program is a promising practice, and we hope that it is expanded. Boston Public Schools, we know, has rich diversity, and we've heard the figures, which I won't go over, in terms of the disparity. But if we are to look at the patterns of underrepresentation within Boston Public Schools, exam schools, admissions process, we must do a fact-based analysis of what drives these disparities. For example, BPS has a requirement on its assessment bids that asks for, quote, documentation to support that assessments are appropriate for a diverse population. Also, within the bidding process, BPS typically elicits bids from multiple vendors and usually approves the qualifying vendor with the lowest bid. Yet, since 2012, over 3 administrations, BPS has awarded sole contracts to the Educational Records Bureau, ERB, the nonprofit behind the Independent School Entrance Exam, ISEE, to the tune of millions of dollars with no elicited bids from other test vendors. So why is this important? Well, according to a GBH report by Molly Borgen, quote, the ERB's 2017 study lacked sufficient sample sizes of students of color to make conclusions about how a high score on its entrance test corresponded to their performance in high school, end of quote. Also, we heard about the Rappaport report by Dr. Goodman, where it states, quote, many talented Black and Hispanic students in BPS do not enroll at exam schools due to various factors that make it difficult for them to exceed in the admissions process, end of quote. What we know is that the ISEE is not aligned with what BPS students are taught. For example, in the math content, the concepts of algebra are not yet taught when 6th graders take the test. So unless BPS students of color receive additional intensive test prep, not just a crash course to prepare them, or coursework, they are at a disadvantage. The Rappaport study also indicates that when we look at why overrepresented populations of students do well with the current exam school admissions process, it is often a matter of opportunity, because ISEE skews admission data in favor of students whose parents have the resources to manipulate the system to their child's advantage. On the other hand, when Black and Latinx students lack these same resources, admission results promote inequity and deny access. BEAM contends that if we are to solve the problem, the issue of disproportionate impact of the exam school's admission process on Black and Latinx students, we must also be willing to holistically examine all contributing factors, not just do thin slicing. For example, disproportionate and inequitable access to both high-quality instruction and school placement. Therefore, we argue that the disproportionality in the exam school's admissions process is representative of disparities that exist throughout the district. We know that there's nothing more powerful than providing all students with access to high-quality instruction, yet Black and brown students have less access to level 1 schools. Also, schools located in communities of color in Boston lack sufficient resources, are inequitably funded, and are disproportionately closed. Further, the research informs us that when a district employs a cadre of highly proficient Black educators, the result can be dramatic in academic grades, assessment outcomes, graduation rates, and college readiness for all students, but most especially Black and brown students. Yet, we continue to find that Black teachers are not being sufficiently hired or retained in BPS, and efforts to improve this continue to be lacking. We must look at these and other issues if we are to solve the problem of disparate exam school enrollment data. For example, if we ask the question, why are there so few Black and Latinx students enrolled in Boston's exam schools, we must also be willing to probe, why are there so many Black and Latinx students labeled with high incidence disabilities and enrolled in substantially separate special education programs? We must also ask, why are so many Black and Latinx males enrolled in segregated special education schools in Boston, like the 3 McKinley schools? If we look at disproportionality, we must look at all patterns of exclusion and segregation, because these are systemic issues of inequity that impact what is happening with regard to the exam school process. In order to confront issues of underrepresentation, we must confront quality of instruction issues, grouping and labeling practices, school assignment, staffing issues, and professional development support for all teachers. We must engage in a discussion about school closures and equitable funding, as these are all interrelated and perpetuate disparate educational outcomes, thus impacting exam school admission. Overall, we must examine and change how these systemic issues shut out gifted and talented students who are Black and brown. We also need to ask, how does BPS policies and practices continually perpetuate these disparities? What are the BPS policies that lack fidelity of implementation regarding providing excellent educational outcomes to students of color? How does the field of research inform us about correcting these inequities? Moving the district towards change that would eliminate these disparities has been like harnessing the wind. However, research informs us that changing this narrative is clearly possible if BPS is willing to make substantive changes to policy and practices that fuel race-based opportunity gaps. We contend that a test on what is taught, not on what is bought, along with other research practices, will acknowledge and honor the gifts and talents of all BPS students, not just some. And I must make a statement about a comment that was made about students at the exam schools with disabilities. I worked as a special education administrator in BPS for many years, and I know that that is an intractable, continuing problem, in that students do get in, but when they require reasonable accommodations, such as a 504, a note taker, if they struggle with executive functioning, which is primarily organizational skills and time management, sometimes they falter. So we really need to take a close look at students with disabilities who are in the exam schools as well, and how the district needs to continue to support them so that they can continue their education in those environments and be successful. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ms. Bazell. And then, Lauren, you had an opportunity to present earlier. Do you have additional comments to make now?
I'll just be brief. I think
Thank you.
There's a couple of things I'll just point out. One is that we hear the comments from multiple folks who've said that this is about more than just exam schools. This is about ensuring equity across BPS. And I want to emphasize that this is just part of a larger effort by groups like ours, like the NAACP, like BEAM, to work together across BPS to ensure equity for things ranging from transportation to ELL access to special education to testing in general. So this is not the first, and this will not be the last conversation that we are having about equity. This is, like I said, just one of many components. The second also I want to emphasize is we certainly celebrate and welcome the changes that the administration is proposing, ranging from things like snacks available for students who are doing the exam school initiative, to having the test available in more sites, to having that transportation available. We certainly welcome all those. The reason that the recommendations we put forward are as broad as they are is because that's what the community told us they wanted. They felt as if even having those changes made was not the same as teaching a child algebra over the course of the year rather than in a matter of weeks. And so we believe that those smaller changes are necessary, especially if they can be implemented quickly, but we don't believe that they replace the need for system-wide change to address the equity crisis, not just at the exam schools, but in BPS generally. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation today. I just have a brief question. We've talked a lot today about the role of the ISCE and whether or not that's the test, whether it should be MCAS or some other measurement, if a test were to remain. As a former teacher, I'm not a super fan of using the MCAS, but I'm curious about the thoughts. Have you all looked at so the ISE in comparison to other tests, if the test were to stay as an option as it is right now and for the unforeseeable future?
I think so. One of the reasons the MCAS isn't one of our suggestions is because, especially from our Latinx and ELL community partners, there was considerable pushback on the experience of students who, especially recent immigrants to the United States, who come and then after about only a year are forced to take a test. At a forum we'll be putting on later, we're actually going to show MCAS questions in Spanish and challenge the audience to see if they can answer mathematical questions in a non-native language and see how many of them can do it, given the time constraints and the young age of the children. One program that we have highlighted is a pilot program done by Schools Without Walls in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., like Boston, is incredibly segregated. Its exam school also was in no way reflective of the demographics of the district. But one thing that Schools Without Walls does is it also has a school-based exam, so a School Without Walls exam. And what the pilot project is proposing is to take the top 15 students in each of the elementary schools. They will automatically be eligible to write the Schools Without Walls exam, and then they'll be entered into a lottery for admission. So rather than rely on a nationwide test, which School Without Walls recognized that students without color were doing quite poorly on compared to their white counterparts, instead use a ranked model and then funnel them towards a school-specific exam that's geared towards the curriculum taught in DC rather than something nationwide, something that hasn't been validated. So I think that's part of the recommendations we've been discussing of have something geared towards the specific curriculum rather than use something nationwide that isn't globally validated.
And I would echo those comments. We are not a fan of having the MCAS as a substitute, and I know that there's been some research by the Rappaport Institute that endorses that, but the comments that were raised by Lauren, we agree with. We believe that the tests should be changed. The ISEE is not appropriate for students of color, and if you continually use it, you're going to get the same results. We also believe that while we applaud BPS for providing tutorials, that it's more than that. A crash course is not sufficient, that students need content and instruction and coursework that is different because that particular test is not aligned with what the BPS curriculum instructs in. So we also believe that the test should be identified, that is any test is going to be biased, but that is less biased, but should be augmented by other measures in terms of students' work, the grading process, students' talents and abilities in other areas, their leadership, their civic involvement. So there are a variety of ways to augment just a simple test and to perhaps have a test but not have as much weight as it currently stands. But we do believe that there are other options, and that's something that we're more than happy to have a further discussion about.
Thank you.
I won't repeat what my colleagues have said, which I do agree with. However, I think we should be driving towards a more comprehensive look at our children. I think we can do a better job of what is suggested, seeing the whole person and not just reducing them down to test scores. And I even heard a comment earlier that even if a kid does do well, he might not get in. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to reconsider. I think looking at a more comprehensive model kind of helps us think critically about a young child that might not do well in school but might test out of the room, and then also think about a young person who does better in the classroom but might not do as well on the test. And so I hope we're driving towards a model that looks at our young people as whole persons and not just as either test scores or their grades. They shouldn't be reduced to that. And I think we should trust our educators. Trust our educators. I think that's really what comes out of this more than anything, that our teachers know their students. They know the ones who excel. They know the strengths and the weaknesses. And I think from educator to educator, they would know exactly from the comments that are given through recommendation whether this young person can actually do the work at the next level or not. And I think that's the model we should be driving to, because I think test models are not as dependable as we might suggest. And I think they're easy, quick band-aid solutions to real bigger problems that are not really thought critically about when it comes to seeing our young people as whole persons.
Great, thank you.
And I'd just like to add that one of our founding members, Jean McGuire, would argue that we should get rid of the test because she got into Latin school without a test and obviously has done very well and continues to have an illustrious career.
Thank you. We're going to reverse order quickly. Councilor Campbell.
I think my mic is on. Thank you, Cora. Can you turn this on? Oh, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you for your work, not just today, but throughout the community. I appreciate the work that you do, and not just on this specific issue, but the larger issues of equity in education, teacher diversity. The list is long, so I want to recognize that. I have to run to another meeting that is external to this building, and I apologize that the hearing has gone over. But this is a conversation we will absolutely continue. I think what was made abundantly clear today is that there are a lot of folks from every walk of life, every neighborhood in the city of Boston who care deeply about this subset issue and the larger issues. And there are people willing to roll up their sleeves and get to work and to make changes along the way. Some in the short term, which has already been done, and we're going to keep pushing to get more information about what those short-term solutions are, but then also the long term. And hopefully attaching a timeline to these recommendations in the long term so that we're not coming back, say, a year, 2 years, and haven't made a decision with respect to what we're going to do systemically to address this issue. So thank you, Councilor Sabi George. And Councilor Janey, thank you so much for your leadership. And I stepped out during Council Flaherty's, I ran to the ladies' room, so I will have a conversation with him to figure out what that was. But I appreciate you always speaking up. Willie, I really appreciate that because it's very important. So thank you.
Councilor Janey.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership in our community. And thank you for your continued work on these very important issues. I know from experience, spending the vast majority of my career in the nonprofit world, in the advocacy community, that despite the number of challenges that we continue to have with our school system, the fact that we are moving forward or taking steps in the right direction is in large part because of the advocates in the room that continue to push and continue to keep holding all of us accountable. So thank you for that. I'm interested in understanding, and I know we're running late, so I won't keep you long, but I'm really interested to see if the three of you have a favorite among the 4 recommendations that were presented as we opened this hearing, and if not among those 4, another recommendation. And then I might have a follow-up question depending on what folks say. So if people can just quickly name what your favorite would be. And just the favorite, not any commentary.
The holistic model.
Holistic model.
I would echo that we do need a holistic model to look at all the students'
The
gifts and
holistic model.
talents.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's been my
Absolutely.
pitch the whole time. Yeah.
So I guess a follow-up question, kind of related to the disparities. So Ms. Brazil, you mentioned disparities within our schools, which we know that we have, but they're part of the larger society. And I think this came up at the event, was it Thursday evening that you hosted? If we're looking at the holistic model, which I'm not arguing against, I think we should always look at the whole person. I think more and more universities are doing that as well, so I think there's precedence there. But if, in fact, we acknowledge that some families have more access to athletics or more ability to participate in athletics or community service or an internship or other things that would be important to look at as we're looking at young people and their contribution to the larger world around them. And then other students are very much connected to those types of things, those types of experiences. How would you then, how would we move forward given that we know that some students would have much more access or opportunity to participate in internships or athletics and other students wouldn't? So if we use that as a weight, then we continue to see the disparities.
Well, I think this dovetails us into a whole different conversation for probably another day writ large. However, I will say that, the city has to take ownership of access for opportunity. I grew up in a public school system where they gave me a saxophone to learn to play in third grade. I played that saxophone all the way till I graduated from high school. I was in chorus. These opportunities were there. My peers, we all played football, baseball, basketball, ran track. I think we have to think critically about how do we comprehensively also support and fund the realities of our young people. And so I think if we're going to have the conversation about moving towards a more holistic model, we also need to have a conversation around how do we help think about budgetary responses to these issues that we know where there are huge inequities and gaps as well. And so that would be where I would hope we would have that conversation saying, how do we strengthen our arts programs? How do we strengthen opportunities in athletics? How do we make sure that we can support families who need the extra transportation to make sure their children get back and forth from practice? How do we make sure that we are supporting educators in that way and we're not cutting parts of our budget that would support a comprehensive evaluation of a young person? So I think, I would love to have that conversation. I'm all in on that conversation because I think we as a city can do a better job of supporting every part of our young people, which I don't think we do very well at times. But I do think if we move towards this model, which I think we should move towards, we need to think critically about implementing programming and putting supports around our young people so they can actually excel. So many scholarship opportunities come from outside of just the academic opportunities that are there. Football scholarships, baseball scholarships, violin, band. There's so many opportunities that our young people in the city may be missing out on because we're not looking at them as at their whole being and only reducing them to test scores and grades. So I would force and push us to think critically about what does that look like, what does it mean to do this work, and what type of money do we want to put behind these efforts if we really want to be serious about closing racial opportunity and achievement gaps.
And I would argue that we need to support our teachers, that our sole bottom line is to educate our students. And we need to look at the instructional practices that are in the classroom. And if our goal is to provide high quality instruction, that means that we need to have professional development that is aligned with the content, with the standards, with the outcomes that we expect to achieve. And all teachers should have access to high quality professional development, ongoing support so that they can bring these strategies and these interventions to the classroom. And I think that's one thing right now that BPS is lacking. There needs to be seamless alignment with what happens in every school in BPS at every grade so that if we do have a population of students that moves frequently, if they move from one school to another, they are going to be reading the same novel, they are going to be engaged in the same content at the same level. So that's a piece that really needs to be worked on. What is the professional development goal and plan for the entire district, and how is that instruction aligned from classroom to classroom? What do all students need to know and be able to do at a grade level, and what are we doing to ensure that that happens? And so if we start there, that's a huge start. I think the district has been moving towards that in the past and perhaps has moved away from that. And I think if you talk to teachers, that's what they're thirsty for, professional development, use of technology, making sure that they have books in the classroom. Copy paper should not be something that they have to pay for themselves. Or, you go into a school and you ask teachers, what do they need? They need books. They need to make copies of books because they don't have the physical books in the classroom. They need technology. So we need to support our teachers. We need to honor the work that they are doing in the classroom and ensure that they have every tool, every strategy, every support that they need in order to do a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Asabi George, and thank you to the panelists for your invaluable input. It was very helpful. And I just want to say thank you to BPS for being here as well, and for our teachers for doing their very best to bring a quality education to every child. It can be difficult, but I think we're doing much better now. We have good leadership. We have excellent teachers. And Boston works best when we work together, and these types of conversations make us a better city. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilor Wu.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed
much of the chunk in the middle. My policy director has been in the room, and I'll review the tape. So would love to follow up offline with you all. This is something I want to make sure to stay very engaged in and talk through some specific ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Zakem.
Thank everyone for their testimony, dedication, and you, Madam Chair, for leading this important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So I do appreciate you being here again and your patience too, being the last group at the end of a long hearing. It's much appreciated for your time today. Also your dedication, because I know for the most part you all volunteer your time to do the work that you do. So I do want to extend my appreciation for that. Councilor Janey, as a lead sponsor, do you have
Many thanks, many thanks. And I look forward to continuing in the work together. So thank you.
So I have one member of the public remaining to testify, and that's Ms. Linda Freeman. Linda, when you come down, if you would just prepare to speak quickly, because we do have another hearing coming in after this. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Councilor Janey, Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Wu, Councilor Zakem. I'll make this as quick as possible. When they're talking about the exam schools, students who transfer from like private and parochial schools, maybe due to the financial circumstances or lack thereof, or don't want to do it anymore. So that's one reason. But I'm going to go back to like the Asian languages and ethnicities that are varied and distinct in the BPS schools, and the students are fully aware of it throughout, you know, wherever they are in the district. And the district itself may not automatically recognize the distinctions, but when the students talk with each other and they figure out who is lived where and how, then they know the variations of the dialect. I found that out just listening to the students, casually. Distinct pronunciation or dialects do vary, even with other native languages among our ELL students. Parents' fluency in English is also fueled in the institutionalized racism, especially throughout BPS and the city of Boston. It's been perpetuated for years. And why? Because I've gotten a taste of it. And those parents I've come across that have less fluency in English are looked on as less educated when it is not so. That type of institutionalized racism has to stop. It is disdainful, it is disgusting. It's not right. The other things is territorial challenges that affect enrollment into the exam schools. We have enough neighborhood challenges. Our students go through enough neighborhood challenges, whether they're the second they step out the doorway, getting on the buses, traveling to wherever their school is. Then they leave school and then come back to those territorial challenges. And if they're known that they're going to an exam school, then that also adds into the dynamics. Reminder robocalls may be needed to be translated into the language spoken at home. Transportation MBTA fare, which are about to go up, may be challenging on the family's budget, especially among working parents or parent or guardian. Locale of the working parent comes into play. The other thing for their not being able to go to take the exam is there's no extended family for the younger siblings. So if you have to take your single child to the exam, you have to drag the rest of the family with you, and that's costly, especially if they don't have a car. The other part is housing loss. And that concludes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. This meeting is adjourned.